If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from a Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. It was May 1863, and a young cavalryman with an elegant red beard and a plumed hat rode into camp with a message for Army Commander Robert E. Lee and Corps Commander Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He informed both men that the Union Army's flank was in the air, meaning it wasn't anchored to prevent a flank attack. This piece of intelligence would result in one of the greatest victories for Lee at Chancellorsville. The horseman's name was James Ewell Brown Stuart, or more commonly known simply as Jeb. He was born on February 6, 1833 in Patrick County, Virginia to Archibald and Elizabeth Letcher Pannell Stuart. Elizabeth's grandfather, Jeb's great-grandfather, was a patriot in the American Revolution. His patriotism was so well known that a loyalist in the county came to his home and shot him dead. Archibald's grandfather was also a patriot during the Revolution, leading a regiment at the Battle of Gettysburg Courthouse. Archibald himself fought against the British during the War of 1812. Jeb's father became a politician after the war, first serving in the Virginia General Assembly and later the U.S. House of Representatives. While a delegate to Virginia's Constitutional Convention from 1829 to 1830, he fought against the slave population counting towards the representation in Virginia's districts, which would give more political power to non-slaveholding or small slaveholding whites, despite being a slave owner himself. This got him no friends with the more wealthier slave owners, and he was unseated in the next election for the General Assembly. Although Archibald was a prominent figure in Virginia, he wasn't wealthy or prosperous. He was said to be the life of the party and maybe liked to drink too much and possibly liked to gamble more than he should, because he did lose his inheritance. Jeb was born at Laurel Hill on land Elizabeth inherited from her martyred grandfather. Probably because of Archibald's fondness for alcohol, Elizabeth required her sons to make a pledge to never take a sip of alcohol, which Jeb did at the age of 12. Archibald, probably because Elizabeth was outspoken about her husband's behavior, stayed away from home a lot. Jeb was named after an uncle, the husband of one of Archibald's sisters, Judge James Ewell Brown. Being one of 10 children and the 7th born to Archibald and Elizabeth, Jeb had plenty of playmates in a large household. 28 slaves lived on the property along with 13 whites. Jeb performed chores with his brothers and sisters and explored the Patrick County countryside. Although Patrick County is technically in the Piedmont region of Virginia, it sits on the western edge, next to the Blue Ridge Mountains and borders North Carolina. Stuart's post office was at Mount Airy, North Carolina. He always enjoyed nature and relished in its beauty, often pressing flowers and leaves to preserve them. His poetry reflected his love of nature and expressed his amazement at natural processes. He also loved his animals, horses and dogs, having a kind heart toward them. One of Stuart's biographers described young Stuart as such. There was a tenderness about young Stuart. Sometimes he concealed it beneath the hardy facade with which he imitated his father. Sometimes he hid it behind a rigid zeal for principles reminiscent of his mother. Often he affected something like tenderness, put it on like a mask to make himself appear properly genteel. But underneath all of this was the genuine article, the soul of a sensitive human being. Jeb was particularly close to his older brother William Alexander. When Alex was 15 and Jeb was 9, they found a hornet's nest on the farm. Determined to have the nest as a trophy, the young boys began throwing sticks at it, but couldn't bring it down. So they began to climb the tree, working their way from branch to branch. When they got close, the hornets came out of their nest and began stinging the boys. Alex wisely tumbled from the tree and got a safe distance away. Not to be outdone by hornets, Jeb just squinted his eyes and pressed on, getting stung multiple times, but getting his prize in the end. As one of his biographers stated, he had inherited both his pa's zest for good times and his mama's demanding standards. At age 12, he left Laurel Hill, only to return for short visits with the family. He went to school in Wytheville, Virginia, remarking to a cousin that he hadn't been in any fights since coming to the school. Within his family, Jeb was known as a fighter, and he made a commitment to himself that he would never be imposed upon, as he said. He added that his lack of conflict did not arise from his own cowardice, but from the timidity of his classmates. When the same cousin remarked that his school failed to serve butter with their food, Stuart responded, "I could not do without butter." While going to school in Wytheville, he lived with family in the area. Measles as well as mumps went around, with Stuart contracting both, but pulling through. He also worked in a law office, where he got to learn about his father's profession, but he remarked to a schoolteacher that he expected to teach. Stuart was bright, but he wasn't an intellectual. He valued his independence and self-reliance. During one Christmas break, he wanted to return home, but couldn't acquire a horse, so he set out on foot across the mountains. After traveling a great distance through what he called half-leg deep snow, he found the home of a relative and stayed there. Although he didn't make it to Laurel Hill, he was still proud of himself and his self-reliance, traveling by himself over such a great distance in horrible weather. Jeb wasn't heartbroken about being away from home for Christmas. He didn't have a close relationship with his parents. Letters were seldom sent to the young man from either his mother or his father. At one point, Jeb wrote to his mother, "I can't see why you don't write me, for you have no idea how acceptable a letter from home is to any son, but especially to one away off at a boarding school, where I never hear from home or anywhere else. I have no doubt that you all have experienced this, and for that reason it appears still more astounding why you do not have mercy upon a poor little insignificant whelp away from his mammy." Jeb became infatuated with women, something he never lost interest in. One of the reasons he wanted to be home during that snowstorm was because he was hoping to see a young lady whom he had become acquainted with. However, just like everyone else, he grew aggravated at one point and declared that he was done with women, that all they brought were trouble. But he quickly came around and flirted with the young ladies about town. He never could stay away from female companionship. After 3 years of schooling around Wytheville, Jeb entered Emory and Henry College at the age of 15. While there, a religious revival swept through the campus and Jeb was caught up in its fervor. It was a Methodist revival, and even though his mother was Episcopalian, Jeb seemed to have taken to this new denomination. Later in life, it would be difficult to find a letter that didn't have some kind of religious bent or nod within its paragraphs. While at Emory and Henry College, he joined a literary and debate society called the Hermesians. During a speech to the group, he became so overwhelmed by the moment, he didn't realize where he was at and fell off the platform on which he was speaking. Jeb didn't do well on exams. He got into a scuffle with one student where he got a bloody nose, then had to take a history exam. He lost 30 valuable minutes taking care of his nose instead of taking the exam, which he worried about greatly. At one point, he planned to place a Bible on his desk during exams to ward off the evils that threw obstacles in his way when taking those exams. After spending 2 years at Emory and Henry College, Jeb needed to decide what he would do once he got educated. Since he wouldn't inherit wealth or land, he needed to join what he called the hireling professions: law, medicine, engineering, and arms. In 1848, Archibald ran for a seat in the House of Representatives again, but lost. However, his opponent, in one of his first acts, nominated Jeb to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He left Emory and Henry in April 1850, taking stagecoaches up the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, stopping briefly in Lynchburg and Salem, Virginia. At a stopover in Charlottesville, Jeb explored the University of Virginia and visited Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, where he took with him a chip off the former president's tombstone and 2 roses from the garden. The women of Charlottesville attracted his attention as well, but not in a good way. He wrote that the women there were the ugliest of the ugly. Jeb then took a steamboat to Washington, D.C. He met President Zachary Taylor a few times walking down the streets while walking around the White House. After meeting the congressman who gave him the appointment, he journeyed to the Senate chamber to watch the proceedings. Jeb decided that Daniel Webster was the finest-looking man in the Senate and determined, of all the pleasant speakers, give me Jeff Davis of Mississippi. Henry Clay appeared very nervous, but possessed an air of dignity and command. Sam Houston appears better with his mouth shut than open. Lewis Cass is a fleshy old fellow with a very fat face. When Jeb went to the House chamber, he found it to be a rowdy place. From there, he grabbed a sprig of arbor vitae as a souvenir, then headed north. He officially became Cadet Stuart on July 1st, 1850. He wasn't a handsome young man at that point. His friends would call him Beauty, which came from his personal comeliness in inverse ratio to the term employed. He hadn't grown the now famous beard yet, but his auburn brown hair would be combed back and over his ears. His blue eyes would flash, twinkle, or pierce depending on his mood. He was still growing, and would grow to 5'10", and was always characterized as sturdy with a barrel chest, but never considered fat, although he loved to eat. He would write, "It almost grieves me when I find myself unable to do justice to a meal for which I have to pay full price, for it has always been my consolation that I always got the worth of my money in the eating line, and precious little did a hotel keeper ever make off me. The erect way he carried himself made him appear taller than he actually was. Stuart had a beautiful voice whether he was issuing commands, singing, or in casual conversation. One cadet remembered that one of the highlights of drill was Stuart's almost musical way of issuing orders. The first summer at the academy was made up of the cadets living in tents and being drilled in infantry and artillery by upperclassmen and academy officials. Stuart quickly took to the military life. He described it as glorious to a cousin in a letter and said that he could live like that the rest of his days if it remained warm enough. His physical prowess made him excel in athletics and anything that required being physically active. However, academics was another situation entirely. He would write, "I used to think I had some idea of what hard study was. At least my mind of it was that it was something to be avoided as much as possible, which before I came here I succeeded at admirably. But on coming here I found that it was necessary to cultivate a more intimate acquaintance with it, or else come out wanting at the examination. So I turned into studying pretty hard. Here every man's grading or standing is definitely established at every examination. It is not made out in decimals or by any complicated process of calculation, but simply his relative standing and his class, and this is published every June in a register to the world, so that if a man is foot, everybody knows it, and if he is head, everybody who wants to can know it." Stuart did okay in English studies. His letters contained a great amount of run-on sentences, and it seemed he had a hard time ending paragraphs, so they continued to be lengthy. But he excelled in mathematics, something he scored higher in than any other class he took, including cavalry tactics. The sectional tensions that consumed the first half of the 19th century across the country invaded the cadets' ranks as well. Some Southerners shunned Northerners, and Stuart himself didn't care for the look or manners of Northern women. He also spoke of the taint of free soul Yankeedom. Although he made these statements, it didn't stop him from befriending Northerners. Olive wrote as Howard from Maine was shunned by many of the cadets, and Southerners in particular, but Stuart befriended him anyway. Howard would recall later that, "I never can forget the manliness of JEB Stuart. He spoke to me, visited with me, and we became warm friends, often on Saturday afternoons visiting the young ladies of the post together. When Howard was sick in the infirmary, Superintendent Robert E. Lee visited him, then Stuart visited with his friend. Once Howard was well, Stuart and Howard visited with Lee and his family, something Stuart did often. Stuart often visited the Lees on Saturday evenings, with the superintendent, his wife, and even his daughter Mary taking a liking to the young man. Miss Lee even sent flowers to Stuart once." Oddly enough, one of Stuart's other dear friends at West Point was Lee's son, Custis Lee, one of the cadets responsible for ostracizing Howard. Throughout Stuart's life, he regularly made friends with two people who were bitter enemies. In Stuart's second year, he became a corporal. The second summer was a splendid time for Stuart, because he now held rank in the cadet corps, and he met Mary Pegram. She was the sister of a fellow classmate and good friend, John Pegram of Virginia. Stuart wrote to a cousin that Miss Mary is intelligent, fascinating, beautiful, and modest, and that she is a Virginian is an enumeration of by no means half of her excellent qualities. When she left with her mother after visiting John, Stuart was distraught and had the blues, as he said. He commented that he couldn't look at the rose she gave him preserved in a glass of water without missing her. In Stuart's third year, he finally got to perform cavalry tactics, and he cut an excellent figure on horseback. He laughed at how horribly the Yankee cadets rode their horses. His instructor was George H. Thomas, a fellow Virginian, and when the rain prevented them from being outside during the cavalry tactics, Thomas brought them inside to the basement of a building where they could ride their horses. More than once a cadet ran into a pillar in that basement and got hurt. From the way Thomas managed riding instructions, the cadets gave him a nickname that was to follow him throughout his career. The horses at West Point were too tired, old, and sick to handle hard riding, and Thomas tried to preserve their precarious health by preventing the cadets from riding too fast. In a normal practice session, a student would start moving at a walk, increase to a trot, then a canter, and then a gallop. During Thomas's sessions, the students moved from a walk to a trot and then eagerly awaited the order to speed up. Thomas almost always disappointed them by ordering slow trot and then walk. Amused and annoyed by their cavalry instructor's refusal to let them ride fast, the cadets started to call him Old Slow Trot, and the name stuck. Stuart wasn't an intellectual, but he was far from unintelligent. He confessed that he had always enjoyed the reputation of being pretty lazy, but lazy in some things, not all things, because even if his body was idle, his mind wasn't. He was constantly thinking. The summer of 1852 brought Stuart a 10-week furlough, like all cadets after completing their 2 years of courses. He only spent 10 days out of the 10 weeks at Laurel Hill. He spent most of his time visiting brothers, sisters, and cousins in Virginia. He spent a lot of time near Martinsville, Virginia, where Betty Hairston lived, his 16-year-old distant cousin. They picked blackberries and strolled around the garden. When he departed, she gave him a drinking gourd, and Stuart inscribed her name on it with his knife. The gourd would hang in his West Point barracks for the rest of the time he was at the academy. Although the infatuation seemed to take on a romantic bent, and he wrote lovingly to her, their relationship quickly became more about friendship, and Stuart confided in Betty, becoming one of his closest confidants. At West Point, Stuart became the center of attention for many of the ladies located there. At one point, he took Miss Lee and a few daughters of other faculty members on a picnic, along with 2 other cadets. However, Stuart lamented that he hadn't received one Valentine that year after all the devotion to the ladies the previous summer. During the 1853 summer encampment, the Dialectic Society, a debate society Stuart belonged to, chose Beauty to deliver the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. When he got up to speak, he explained, "I always thought I had enough brass, but when I rose before such an audience to perform the part assigned me, I felt quite embarrassed, and would have willingly crawfished if it had been possible. But I had to stand up to the rack, fodder or no fodder, so I put on a bold face and drove ahead." As Stuart neared graduation, he had a huge decision to make. Would he stay with the Army or become a civilian? Although he owed his country 8 years of service, the Army was too small to fit all the new cadets, so he could choose to leave the service after graduation. He wrote to his lawyer father, not seeking his advice, but telling him the situation. Rather than relying on his father, he wrote that he would trust in his heavenly Father to decide where he should go. Stuart did think about being a lawyer, but he couldn't convince himself that it was a good living, saying that it was too precarious of a job and too overcrowded of a profession. He gave no thought to being a farmer because he neither had a farm nor capital with which to buy one. Stuart graduated 13th in the West Point class of 1854, alongside many future Civil War generals like Archibald Gracie, John Pegram, Custis Lee, Stephen D. Lee, James Deschler, William Dorsey Pender, and Stephen Weed. Stuart would stay with the Army. He found a home and family within the Army and among the West Pointers. He would say, "The taste of classmates for each other's society, particularly West Pointers, is unequaled by the strongest attachment, and what is more remarkable, it becomes more and more intense as time continues. A thought which makes me fear that out of the Army I will be miserably unhappy." Stuart spent the summer after his graduation visiting friends and family around Virginia and North Carolina. On one of his infrequent trips to Laurel Hill, he found his commission as a second lieutenant in the 2nd Mounted Rifles, who were on patrol near the Rio Grande in Texas. One of Stuart's biographers described the young soldier's mentality as he entered the Army. As he prepared to make his way in the big world, Stuart determined 2 things. He never wrote them down or articulated them to anyone, perhaps not even to himself, but he acted them out as surely as if he had. Stuart determined to live fully, to miss no opportunity, to experience life as richly and completely as he was able. He would accept whatever circumstances he found himself in, and do his best to make the best of the situation. Actually, this was a renewed determination. He had developed this approach to his life as a young boy away at school, and had been refining it ever since. Stuart also determined not to get lost. He would maintain contact with his friends, and make sure that no one who could help him forgot him. In order to be promoted in a peacetime army, Stuart would have to promote himself. Stuart was ordered to join his new company at Fort McIntosh by mid-October. He left the day after he received the order, going to New York to purchase equipment, but stopped by Washington, D.C. first. There he found that a yellow fever scare in New Orleans resulted in his leave being extended, since he would have to travel through that city to his duty station. Stuart went on to New York to purchase his equipment, made a brief stop at West Point, then went back home to await his orders to journey west. By fall, Jeb journeyed to St. Louis, where he was again delayed because of yellow fever in New Orleans, but in late November he got on a steamboat destined for the city. When he arrived, the city didn't impress him. He stayed there only one night, then got on a steamer to take him to the Texas coast. While on the ship, a norther blew in, and rocked the boat. Jeb was horribly seasick from the encounter. When the boat docked at Galveston, he was so ill that it took him 12 hours to realize that dry land was only a few steps away. Another boat ride along the Texas coast saw the boat dock next to the shore for 2 nights as it traveled along the coast. Stuart had difficulty sleeping amid the sounds of seagulls and wolves. When he landed at Corpus Christi, he waited there until a wagon train set off for Laredo, the location of his company. When he got to Laredo, he found that his company was further west at Fort Davis. Along the way, he hunted rabbits and wild hogs, but when he got to Fort Davis on January 19th, he discovered his company was even further west. 2 months after leaving St. Louis, Stuart finally joined his company on the Texas frontier. The expedition that the company was currently on was led by Major John S. Simonson. Their base camp was called Camp Stuart, named after a fellow soldier from South Carolina, not Jeb. From the base camp, the company split up looking for Native Americans, with Jeb's group going to the Guadalupe Mountains along the Mexican border, Jeb being in charge of the artillery, which consisted of 1 cannon. On the journey, they reached a place over 2,000 feet above the valley. Only a narrow trail led down from the precipice. Stuart enlisted the majority of the company to wrestle the carriage as well as the caisson down the trail, while he and a band of Texas Rangers lowered the barrel down the cliffs with ropes. When Stuart returned to camp with the gun reassembled, Simonson confessed that he thought he would never see that gun again, but Stuart had accomplished an amazing feat and brought back the artillery piece, safe and sound. When the company of men continued to chase after Comanches, they met another group of soldiers, this group led by Major James Longstreet. Both were chasing Indians across the difficult terrain. When Stuart's group made camp, a humongous gust of wind swept across the landscape, scattering their campfires, setting fire to the prairie, their tents, horses, and themselves. Many men had their beards singed by the flames. Stuart lost part of his belongings in the fire, having to write letters on partially burnt stationery. When the group made it back to their base camp, Stuart commented on that camp really felt like home to us, and our floorless, chairless, and comfortless tents looked luxurious after a week's shelter beneath the broad canopy of heaven. Stuart was only on the Texas frontier for about 3 months. During that time, he wore out a pair of thick-soled shoes and resorted to wearing a pair of embroidered slippers for a time. But it was also during this time in West Texas that he started growing his now iconic beard. He wrote to a dear friend that the beard so altered my physique that you could not recognize me. In the spring of 1855, the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, created 2 cavalry regiments, the 1st and 2nd U.S. Cavalry. Competition was tough, but Davis leaned toward giving Southerners positions in those 2 units. Stuart would be chosen to be a part of the 1st U.S. Cavalry with the permanent rank of 2nd Lieutenant. His previous was only a brevet. Other future Civil War generals included within those 2 regiments' ranks were Albert Sidney Johnston, Joseph E. Johnston, George Thomas, John Bell Hood, Edmund Kirby Smith, Earl Van Dorn, William Hardy, and John Sedgwick. Jeb made it to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis in June, and then Fort Leavenworth, Kansas by July, to report for duty as the quartermaster for the 1st U.S. Cavalry Regiment. As the quartermaster of the 1st Cavalry Regiment, Stuart had the difficult job of procuring supplies and transporting it to the troops over difficult terrain. On one occasion, his company was stationed at Westport, Missouri, a few miles south of Kansas City. The day before his men and horses would run out of forage and rations, Stuart had to traverse gullies and thick forests through the night, riding 34 miles in 10 hours, arriving at Fort Leavenworth at 10 o'clock. He organized the loading of rations and forage, then led the teamsters and food through the difficult terrain. In some instances, trees had to be cut down to allow for the wagons to pass along the road. This one trip was part of Stuart's normal routine as the quartermaster. Fort Leavenworth in the summer of 1855 didn't look like much, with a few brick, stone, and log buildings making up the barracks and other military buildings. But to Stuart, it looked urban compared to the camps in Texas. Plus, women were at Fort Leavenworth. Stuart wrote, "Some 7 or 8 young ladies can always hoist a sail for amusement." However, one young lady caught Stuart's eye, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook of the 2nd Dragoons. Her name was Flora. She had just finished her schooling at a finishing school, and her parents wanted her to go to Philadelphia, but she wanted to visit her parents in Fort Leavenworth. The first time Jeb saw Flora was during a review for the troops. She was on a nervous horse, but she handled the animal beautifully, and she was an excellent rider. Knowing his own love of horses and horsemanship, Stuart's infatuation soared. Stuart asked Flora if she would like to go on a ride with him. She agreed, and soon they were going on rides every evening. Flora was more than a good rider. She could even shoot, and she was a Virginian. Like Stuart, she sang and even played the guitar. As one of Stuart's biographers wrote, Stuart was more than charmed. He was smitten. In September 1855, less than 2 months after their first ride together, they were engaged to be married. Stuart described the courtship in Latin, Vena vidi victus sum. I came, I saw, I was conquered. They planned a November wedding at Fort Riley, Kansas, where Flora's father was now stationed. Lieutenant Colonel Cook stated that he thought his daughter's wedding plans were rather sudden, but he described his soon-to-be son-in-law as a remarkably fine and promising pure young man. Before he could get married, Jeb's troop needed to go on an extended patrol along the Oregon Trail toward Laramie. Along with planning a wedding, the nearly 900-mile journey required his logistical planning as quartermaster. When he returned from the expedition, he received 2 letters, one from his father consenting to the marriage, and the second from Flora telling him of Archibald's death on September 20th. Although Stuart described the situation as heartrending, the father and son didn't have much of a relationship because they simply did not spend much time together. Jeb and Flora were married on November 14th, 1855, in a small wedding, and Flora wore her graduation dress. The two moved to Fort Leavenworth but didn't remain long because Stuart got leave to take his wife to Virginia to meet his family. After a whirlwind tour, Stuart headed back to Fort Leavenworth, and Flora remained in the East to recuperate from the fast-paced tour. Elizabeth Stuart, Flora's now mother-in-law, attempted to gift her a slave to take back to Kansas, but because slavery was such a contested issue in Kansas, Flora refused the gift. On December 20th, 1855, Stuart was promoted to first lieutenant in appreciation for his abilities and talents as quartermaster. The meager pay of a soldier made Stuart look elsewhere for additional income to support his family. He would stay in the Army, but he dabbled in real estate, buying and selling land in Leavenworth, going in on business ventures, sometimes winning and sometimes losing, but this allowed Stuart to live more comfortably and provide a nice life for he and his wife. Stuart exhibited an almost cutthroat way of looking at the world when he wrote to a cousin he frequently corresponded with in St. Louis, Missouri. I may speak freely, as I am without such advantages myself. I am embittered against modern fashionable society. When I find myself elbowed in saloons by the puppies who plume themselves upon $100,000, a handsome person, and a European tour. Believing himself superior in spirit and mind, Stuart had decided not to meet these gentlemen in lists, where they are my superiors. Stuart determined to gain position, information, influence, a name first, and then, with the prestige of a name, go if we choose and make the denizens of fashion bow before us. Stuart advised his cousin to find his success in southwestern Virginia, where he could become a country gentleman of fortune, and then confront wider society with his superiority knowledge. Having lectured his cousin on the law and counseled him about life, Stuart proceeded to preach to him on the practice of virtue. Virtue, in Stuart's mind, was the opposite of the elegant vices of city life, and he had no good feelings for society either, invoking the parable of the prodigal son in language if not by name. Stuart decried his first cousin's new-made city friend, and concluded the voices of home and friends and patriotism and old associations cry, "Come back, come back." When Flora returned to Fort Leavenworth, it was as if they had never parted. Flora had been raised in a military family and understood and accepted that her husband would be gone for long periods of time. In December 1856, Flora would become pregnant with their first child. 1856 was a tense time in Kansas. Popular sovereignty, the concept that citizens of a state or territory could decide whether to be free or slave, resulted in a small civil war within the proposed state. It became known as Bleeding Kansas, as each side attempted to punish the other and run them out of the state, or make them so afraid that they bent to the other's will. The Army's job was to keep the peace as much as possible. In June 1856, Stuart and his detachment, led by Colonel Edwin Sumner, rode into camp of some armed Free Soilers. Sumner's orders were to disperse armed bands. The Free Soilers were led by a man named John Brown. A few days before, at the Battle of Blackjack, Brown and his men had fought a battle with pro-slavery forces and won, taking some prisoners. Sumner convinced Brown to release his prisoners, which included a man named Henry Clay Pate, a former student at the University of Virginia and a deputy United States Marshal. Stuart did little more than watch the proceedings. In the summer of 1857, an increase in attacks on white settlers by the Cheyenne led the 1st Cavalry to launch a campaign against the tribe. Jeb began the campaign as a quartermaster, but when he and Sumner disagreed over accountability procedures involving government property, Sumner removed him as quartermaster and gave him command of Company G of the 1st Cavalry. The expedition left Fort Leavenworth with 4 cavalry companies, a 6-mule ambulance, 300 beef cattle, and 50 wagons carrying supplies, food, equipment, and ammunition. When it got to Fort Kearny on June 4th, it acquired infantry, some dragoons, Pawnee scouts, and more wagons. The group continued to Fort Laramie, where the dragoons left for service in Utah, but the rest continued after the Cheyenne. On July 29, 1857, after 18 months on the frontier, Jeb saw his first hostile Native American. It was on Solomon's Fork of the Smoky Hill River in northwest Kansas. Sumner assembled his force, intending for his center to hold the Cheyenne in place while his wings hit the flanks. Stuart wanted to advance within carbine range, fire a volley, and then charge with revolvers. But when they got to within carbine range, Sumner ordered draw sabers, charge. The Cheyenne broke before the Federal soldiers had time to collide with them, and now it became a pursuit. Stuart and 3 others, including an officer named Lunsford Lomax, chased after the Cheyenne for longer than the others, going for 5 miles. Stuart's horse Dan gave out, so Stuart hailed a private who traded him horses. On a new mount, Jeb gave chase. When he caught up to his comrades, they had cornered a lone Cheyenne warrior. Stuart charged him and shot him in the thigh with his revolver as he rode by. Another soldier dismounted and was going to shoot the Indian, but the gun went off accidentally before he had time to aim. Defenseless, the soldier stood next to his mount, with the wounded Indian limping closer with the revolver, ready to shoot him. Stuart charged again, now with his saber. The charging horseman got the Indian's attention. As Stuart's blade crashed into the Indian's skull, the Cheyenne's pistol discharged into Stuart's chest. 2 other soldiers ended the Indian's life, and Stuart gingerly got off his horse. The Kansas sun was bearing down on the wounded soldier, so his comrades stuck their sabers into the ground and stretched a blanket over them to shield Jeb from the sun. When Sumner arrived, he ordered Stuart to be carried to where the engagement began. They got 3 miles before the doctor arrived. The doctor examined him and found that Stuart was lucky. The bullet hit his sternum and deflected, lodging beneath his left nipple. The bullet hit nothing vital, and as long as infection didn't set in, Jeb would make a full recovery. The cavalry officer was bandaged up and rode on some cushions attached to a 2-wheeled cart made from a broken ambulance. The pain grew with each bump in the road, and the soreness coursed through his upper body. On July 31st, Stuart and the other wounded men, along with 1 Cheyenne prisoner, were escorted toward Fort Kearny, while the rest of the force chased after the Indians. Stuart and the detachment rested for a few days before setting off for the 120-mile journey. On August 4th, a small group of Cheyenne attacked their camp, but they were driven away without casualties to either side. The group began their march to Fort Kearny, reliant on the Pawnee guides sent from Sumner. However, a few days into the trip, the guides left them, and with no compass, the group was completely lost. Stuart, not fully healed but healthy enough to withstand the job, volunteered to lead a scouting party to find their way to Fort Kearny. Stuart used stakes drilled into the ground to find his way back. At one point, a storm blew through. The soldiers were forced to sit on their grounded saddles with their head down as the rain and wind beat them until the storm blew over. Clouds prevented Stuart from reading the stars to determine the direction of north, but on the night of August 16th, the night watch woke Stuart up. The clouds dispersed and the stars were prominent. Stuart got a bearing and the next morning headed north, where he got to a river. The group traveled upstream to a ford, and on the other side was a wagon road. Now Stuart knew where he was. This was the Big Blue River, and the wagon road was the one that carried people from Fort Leavenworth to Fort Kearny. The group arrived at Fort Kearny on August 17th, and a rescue party left the fort to find the lost detachment. In September 1857, Flora gave birth to their first child, who Jeb insisted to be named after the child's mother. Stuart proclaimed that I have the prettiest and smartest baby in North America. Also that fall, the Stuarts moved to Fort Riley, where Jeb was transferred. The new father continued to speculate in land, and even tried his hand at invention. He developed a detachable clip made for a sword and scabbard, so a soldier wouldn't have to take off his belt to take off his sword. The army was so impressed with his invention that the War Department gave him a 6-month leave of absence in the latter half of 1859 to go to Washington, procure a patent, and negotiate the sale of his saber hook. He would use the leave to attend the General Convention of the Episcopal Church as a lay delegate. Although he joined the Methodist Church at Emory and Henry, he most likely gravitated toward the Episcopals because army chaplains tended to be Episcopalians. He also helped found the Episcopal Church of the Covenant in Junction City, Kansas, while stationed at Fort Riley. He officially became an Episcopalian in St. Louis on his way to the General Convention. While in Virginia on leave, he visited family, even paying a visit to Emory and Henry College, giving a speech to the Hermesian Society, telling the story about his last speech 10 years before when he fell off the platform. In Washington, he patented his saber hook and then sold it to the government for $5,000 and would receive $1 for each device sold by the manufacturer. He was outside the War Department offices in Washington waiting for a meeting with Secretary of War Floyd on October 17th when he heard whispers about trouble happening at a place called Harper's Ferry. The rumors swirled and grew as Stuart listened. 3,000 men were said to have taken over the federal arsenal and armory in the town, with most of them being black. It was a slave revolt. Stuart was there when Floyd decided to do something about the alleged revolt, and the young officer volunteered to take a summons from the War Office to Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was across the Potomac River at Arlington on leave. Stuart had visited the Lees at Arlington before, but this was official business. Lee and Stuart went to the White House with Floyd to discuss what to do next. The only available troops were about 90 Marines at the Naval Yard and some Maryland militia, so that would have to do for the moment. Virginia militia were already there, and more were on the way. Lee was placed in command of the operation, and Stuart volunteered to be Lee's aide. Lee and Stuart set off on a train to Harper's Ferry. They met the Marines about a mile outside of the town, where Lee learned that the size of the force at Harper's Ferry had been exaggerated. It was only a handful of armed men, and they were trapped in the fire engine house. Their leader was named Smith, and his men and their hostages were still in the engine house when Lee, Stuart, and the Marines arrived in town. Lee ordered the building surrounded and then drew up the surrender terms to be delivered to the men in the engine house. Stuart would give the terms of immediate surrender to Smith and his band of men. Lee anticipated that the surrender terms would be rejected, so he prepared the Marines to assault the engine house when Stuart gave the signal. The Marines were not to fire their weapons, only bayonets were to be used, so that no one innocent would get hit by a stray bullet. On the morning of October 18th, Stuart went up to one of the big doors of the engine house with his white flag. When Stuart addressed the men inside the engine house, the door opened about 4 inches, and the snout of a carbine came out and put in Stuart's face. Mr. Smith was the one aiming the rifle, but Stuart recognized the old man. Not as Mr. Smith, but as John Brown from Kansas. Stuart read the surrender terms, but Brown immediately tried to bargain, wanting safe passage out of Harper's Ferry for the hostages. Jeb declined the bargain, and as he did so, one of the hostages, Lewis Washington, a distant descendant of President Washington, yelled out, "Never mind us, fire!" Lee recognized the voice and called out, "The Revolutionary blood does tell." Realizing that Brown wouldn't surrender, Stuart waved his hat and stepped out of the way. The Marines began to beat on the door with sledgehammers, but it wasn't damaging the door, so they picked up a ladder and used it as a battering ram to knock a hole in the door, through which the Marines poured and overtook Brown and his company. Once Brown was in custody, Stuart relieved Brown of his bowie knife and kept it as a souvenir. Lee then dispatched Stuart and some troops to the Kennedy Farm, a farmhouse used by Brown to prepare for the raid on Harper's Ferry. Jeb collected the documents and weapons stored at the house and brought them to Harper's Ferry. During the interrogation of Brown, Stuart listened until Brown stated that the Golden Rule justified his deeds. Stuart fired back, "But don't you believe in the Bible?" Brown said that he did, and that pretty much ended Stuart's interaction during the interrogation. It wasn't long after the involvement in the suppression of the raid on Harper's Ferry that Stuart returned to Kansas. He invested the $5,000 in the Bank of the State of Missouri that would get him 10% interest. After his role at Harper's Ferry, Stuart hoped to gain a captaincy in the Army. Since 1857, he had been on a campaign gathering support for that promotion, writing especially to the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, to support such a promotion. The new governor that took office in 1860 was John Letcher, an uncle to his mother. Stuart's hopes increased since he now had a family member in office. In a letter to his mother, Jeb demonstrated his yearning for the promotion and recognition for his service in capturing John Brown. "I feel that I did all that my position allowed me to do, and for it I claim nothing. but if a bill passed the legislature of Virginia, rewarding Lieutenant Israel Green, the commander of the Marines at Harper's Ferry, and not including me, I would feel exceedingly mortified. I shall certainly expect every friend I have in either house, if I have any, to insist upon my being included. To reduce the thing to a nutshell, it is this. Greene was ordered to do what he did. I voluntarily left important business in Washington and accompanied Colonel Lee. Greene is a resolute noble fellow, and Virginia might well vote him thanks, a sword or something, but remember what I said. The tumultuous year of 1860 and its presidential election wasn't watched as closely by Stuart as some, in part because Stuart wasn't that political. He subscribed to the Richmond Examiner, which editorially was pro-secession, but he ultimately was a Virginiaphile, following what Virginia's course would be. But the biggest reason he didn't watch the politics unfold in 1860 was because for months the 1st Cavalry were assigned to launch operations against the Kiowa and Comanche. He would be away from Flora when she had their second child in June of 1860. His name was Philip St. George Cook Stuart, named after Flora's father. During that summer, Jeb lived on the frontier chasing after Indians, eating buffalo meat roasted over an open fire on a stick, and having freshly caught fish for almost every meal. On an assignment to find water, Stuart rode 120 miles in 35 hours, with only 1.5 hours of sleep. In July, he finally found the elusive Kiowa and their chief, Satonko. The chase began at Bent's Fort in modern-day Colorado, and went for 26 miles. A patrol from Bent's Fort spotted the dust clouds and mistook Stuart's command for the Kiowa and ordered a charge. Jeb quickly realized what was happening and ordered his bugler to sound off so that those soldiers knew who they were. It worked, and an incident was avoided. The two cavalry units merged and continued the chase. They were chasing not only Kiowa warriors, but also women and children, as the entire village was on the move. What resulted was the Battle of Blackwater Springs, and saw a handful of casualties on each side, including the chief's brother and son. Some women and children were taken captive and kept at Bent's Fort as hostages to ensure safe travel for whites moving through the area. In early August, John Sedgwick, the leader of the cavalry contingent, ordered his forces back to Fort Riley. Stuart made it back to Flora on August 15th to find a beautiful baby boy. However, he didn't stay long with his growing family. In September, his troops set off again to the east of Bent's Fort to establish Fort Wise on the Arkansas River. By November, Stuart constructed a comfortable home for he and his family and planned to move Flora and the children there in the spring. The uncertainty of the secession winter is reflected in Jeb's letter-writing campaign. He wrote a letter to John Letcher, the governor of Virginia, asking for help getting a promotion to captain, but if secession occurred, would tender his services to Virginia. In a letter to Jefferson Davis in January 1861, knowing that Davis would have some role in the military in a southern nation, asked for a place in the army if Virginia seceded. He wrote to his brother William Alexander Stuart in Wytheville, Virginia, suggesting to raise a legion of cavalry from the county for service in Virginia, and if no war broke out, but Virginia seceded, he would resign from the army and practice law in Memphis, Tennessee. Stuart worked for a law office in his younger days, but had no training in law, and if he was focused on Virginia, why would he settle in Memphis? Those statements are confusing, and answers may never be known as to why he thought he wanted to be a lawyer in Memphis. Stuart also wrote to Abraham Lincoln's Attorney General Edward Bates to attempt to get a promotion to captain in the United States Army if Virginia didn't secede. On March 4, 1861, Stuart got a 2-month leave from the Army. He first traveled to Fort Riley, and then St. Louis, then back to Fort Riley, trying to get an understanding of the political situation erupting in the country. When he learned that Virginia voted for secession in mid-April, he packed his stuff and took his family east, first to St. Louis, then took a steamboat down the Mississippi River to Memphis. At Cairo, Illinois, he mailed his resignation letter from the Army, and mailed a letter asking the Adjutant General of the Confederacy, Samuel Cooper, for a position in the Army commensurate to his rank. Stuart's mother wrote a letter to Robert E. Lee, now commanding Virginia's forces, asking for a place for her son in Virginia's army. By train, the family moved through Tennessee, then on to Richmond, Virginia. On May 10th, Robert E. Lee, his mentor at West Point, gave Stuart the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Provisional Army of Virginia. The young man went from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel overnight, and would fight for his home state of Virginia. At the beginning of 1861, amid the turmoil of secession, Stuart expressed his politics succinctly. For my part, I have no hesitancy from the first that, right or wrong, alone or otherwise, I go with Virginia. Stuart's first assignment was at Harper's Ferry, reporting to Colonel Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Before going to Harper's Ferry, he found out that the United States government had promoted him to captain, but he was out of that army now and embarking on a career in a new army. One of Stuart's biographers summed up Jeb's placement in the Army of Virginia when he wrote, "Virginia and Stuart were within the Southern fold. Moreover, this new nation was at war, and Stuart had spent more than a third of his life acquiring precisely the skills and credentials his new country needed most. He had spent 4 years of intense study and training at West Point. Then for the last 7 years he had gained varieties of experience on active duty. He had joined a brand new army and advanced from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel overnight. Stuart's opportunities seemed limitless. Most of his young life had been a conscious struggle to make good. Here was the wonderful chance for conspicuous success." Stuart arrived at Harper's Ferry on May 10th. Jeb gravitated to his new superior. Jackson liked Jeb as well, even ignoring the fact that Stuart's commission was in the infantry and gave him control of the cavalry companies under his command, since Stuart possessed great experience with the cavalry. This angered Turner Ashby, who sought that position, so Jackson split his cavalry companies, giving Stuart one regiment and Ashby the other, then separating the two, with Ashby patrolling the Potomac River. Ashby wasn't the only one who took offense at Stuart's rise in rank. William E. Jones, also known as Grumble Jones, was a West Point trained soldier and possessed experience, yet Stuart outranked the older Jones. Jones wouldn't forgive Stuart for his superiority in rank. When Joseph E. Johnston arrived at Harper's Ferry a few weeks after Stuart, he took command of all the forces there in the name of the Confederate Army, superseding and taking control of Virginia's army. Johnston withdrew his forces from that border area to Winchester, Virginia. A Federal army was located just a few miles away at Martinsburg. Stuart situated his camp halfway between the two armies at Bunker Hill to monitor the Federal movements. Cavalry units came to Stuart's camp, new recruits who had never seen battle before or heard shots fired in anger. Jeb needed to train these men in the ways of war and cavalry tactics. He believed that the best way to learn was to do. He spent less time on formation and more time acclimating his men to combat. Brand new recruits were taken on raids through and behind enemy lines. On numerous occasions, Stuart's band of horsemen would be surrounded on 3 sides, and he told them they may have to cut their way out. But Stuart always found his way out of harm's way, threading the needle on many occasions. When the Union Army located at Martinsburg moved toward Winchester, Stuart used the inexperienced Federal troops as a tool to teach his troops. He put out a skirmish line, and when Union soldiers got to within about 200 yards, he pulled his men back slowly, walking on foot. When the Federals halted, he brought many of his men around him and said, "Now I want to talk to you men. You are brave fellows, and patriotic ones too, but you are ignorant of this kind of work, and I am teaching you. I want you to observe that a good man on a good horse can never be caught. Another thing, cavalry can trot away from anything, and a gallop is a gait unbecoming a soldier, unless he is going toward the enemy. Remember that, we gallop toward the enemy, and trot away always." About that time, an artillery shell whizzed high over the men's heads. Stuart's eyes flashed with excitement. "There, I've been waiting for that and watching those fellows. I knew they'd shoot too high, and I wanted you to hear how shells sound." Stuart got his men used to the sound of battle without putting them in danger, and also taught them the range of weaponry so they knew when to take cover. Most soldiers learned marching formations, but Stuart taught combat. The new recruits initially thought their new commander a fool, but after his combat training, they declared him some weird genius. Through Stuart's classes, it's arguable to say that Stuart's horsemen were the best trained and most experienced soldiers as a group when the first major battles erupted. Stuart and his cavalry, which numbered not even 350 men, monitored a 50-mile front for Johnston and his army. Johnston trusted Stuart, and when Johnston would later go west, he wrote to Stuart and said, "How can I eat, sleep, or rest in peace without you upon the outpost?" On one of Stuart's scouting missions, he came upon a group of Union soldiers near a fence. Wearing a blue uniform, Stuart approached the Federals and ordered them to dismantle the fence so his cavalry could come through. Once the Federal soldiers took down the fence, Stuart pulled out his pistol and told them to throw down their weapons. They were now his prisoners, 46 of them in all. Jeb's troopers came riding up and took the men into captivity. However, 3 of them tried to resist and lost their lives because of it. In mid-July 1861, Johnston needed to extricate himself and his army from the Shenandoah Valley and meet Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard near Manassas Junction, where a much larger Union force was advancing from Washington, D.C. Stuart screened Johnston's movements, preventing the Union army at Martinsburg from discovering that Johnston had left. That Federal army didn't know that the Confederates were out of their front until July 20th, when all of Johnston's army was at Manassas. Once Johnston was safely on his way, Stuart and his horsemen rode east, arriving at Manassas on July 20th. As the First Battle of Manassas erupted, Stuart was forced to pace and wait until ordered to go forward. Several times he rode to Beauregard, informed him that he and his men were ready for service when needed, then rode back to wait and pace about. For most of the day, Stuart worried he would miss out on the battle, as cannons roared and muskets cracked in the distance. Finally, at 2 p.m., a messenger arrived saying, "Colonel Stuart, General Beauregard directs that you bring your command into action at once, and that you attack where the firing is hottest." The horsemen rode toward the battle. The route took them through an outdoor field hospital, where men lay dying and horribly mangled from battle. Surgeons removed limbs, and the cavalrymen attempted to look away, but the sight caused them to throw up on their way to battle. As they arrived at the scene of battle, they saw a unit wavering, dressed in red pants, blue jackets, red hats, and white gaiters. Thinking they were Confederate Zouaves, they called out, "Don't run, boys. We are here." Then Stuart noticed the flag, the stars and stripes. Jeb quickly ordered a charge. At 30 yards away, the Zouaves released a volley of musketry. The wall of flame hit the rebel horsemen, but Stuart thundered on. The Zouaves attempted to load their guns as the horsemen got closer, but before they could, Stuart smashed into the Zouaves' ranks. The rebel horsemen slashed and shot their way through the Northerners. Then Jeb reformed his men in the woods and then proceeded over to the left of the Confederate line to protect an artillery battery. From there, he could see the whole battle unfold, and he sent messages to the infantry commanders, letting them know what was developing. At 4 p.m., Stuart and the artillery battery accompanied Jubal Early's brigade in the advance to push the Union forces off the field. As the Federal troops ran toward Washington, Stuart sent a message to Beauregard asking for permission to pursue. But before he got any word back, he realized that he needed no permission to perform the obvious and set out after the Federals. He captured so many men and detailed so many of his troopers to escort his prisoners back to their lines that after only a short distance, he had too few troopers to pursue the enemy. His advance stopped near Sudley Church, and he made his headquarters at a local farmhouse. Writing to Flora after the battle, he wrote, "I am your own darling husband, whose thoughts and affection are centered in his own dear Flora, and even in the fiercest of fire of the battlefield, I thought of her, and how proud she would be to see the conduct of her husband. The papers have said very little about my regiment, but the generals have said a great deal. You need not be surprised to see your hubby a brigadier. I have been in one real battle now, and feel sure I can command better than many I saw." When Stuart discovered that the Confederate army would not advance on Washington after the victory at First Bull Run, he moved his command to Fairfax Courthouse and set up outposts to detect enemy movement and screen the actions of the Confederate Army of the Potomac under Johnston. Jeb conducted these outpost operations superbly. A non-commissioned officer and 4 to 6 men made up an outpost guarding a designated area. Those outposts laid about half a mile from the company headquarters. 200 yards in front of the outpost was a single man called a vidette. It was his responsibility to fire his weapon when the enemy was spotted. Then the men on the outpost and the company that was a half mile away would ride to the scene of the action. The men on the outpost would change every 4 hours to prevent fatigue and exhaustion. In this way, Stuart protected the Confederate army from surprise attacks, placing outposts all around the army. Even though there were supposed to be a change in the guards every 4 hours, some companies were placed on outpost duty for sometimes days on end, but such was the situation when Stuart's command was so small. When Stuart rode to one of his outposts, one of his soldiers told him about not having enough provisions and being tired. Stuart responded, "Oh, nonsense. You don't look starved. There's a cornfield over there. Jump the fence and get you a good breakfast. You don't want to go back to camp, I know. It's stupid there, and all the fun is out here. I never go to camp if I can help it." Stuart took part in the soldiers' plot. He patrolled between outposts himself, and one of his troopers claimed that Stuart didn't return to his camp for an entire month at one time, preferring to stay at the outposts. Another soldier wrote to his wife that Stuart sleeps every night on Munson's Hill without even a blanket under or over him, never resting, always vigilant, always active. One soldier recalled, From personal experience and observation of General Stuart, as well as from the testimony of others, I am disposed to think that he contributed to every man qualities and tastes like his own. Insensible to fatigue himself, he seemed never to understand how a well man could want rest, and as for hardship, there was nothing in his view which a man ought to enjoy quite so heartily except danger. Stuart believed that weariness of one soldier would rub off on others, so the tired, sick, and slightly injured men and horses were sent to a separate camp called the Cripple Company, or Company Q. During his time at Fairfax Courthouse, he met Antonia J. Ford, a woman of Southern loyalty. He and his staff met with her, and Stuart liked her company so much that he made her an honorary aide-de-camp to himself, and he even drew up a mock commission for her. Over a year later, Antonia was detained by Union officers on the suspicion of being a Southern spy, and that commission was found. The joke got her a few months in the old Capitol Prison in Washington. On September 11th, the Federals made a reconnaissance in force toward Louisville with 2,000 soldiers. Stuart's outpost alerted him of the danger, and he set off with about 300 infantry, an artillery battery, and 2 companies of horsemen to confront the enemy. He positioned and instructed the infantry to fire on the Union artillery battery, used his own artillery to scatter the Union infantry, and kept his cavalry in reserve to use in the case of a retreat. Stuart didn't lose a single man and caused a handful of casualties on the Union side. The Federal force was already withdrawn when Stuart got there, but he hastened their withdrawal with his pressure. When Stuart reestablished his outpost, he found a message attached to a tree that a Union officer left. It was from Orlando Poe, someone Stuart had known since his time at West Point. It was addressed to "My Dear Beauty." Said he hated to not have seen Stuart, but invited the Confederate cavalrymen to dinner at the Willard Hotel in Washington on Saturday. Stuart didn't respond, just laughed, and wrote his own message at the bottom of the letter saying that Poe may have seen him had he stopped long enough in his retreat to look back. Stuart wrote a report of the action and his time at the outposts to his immediate superior, who was James Longstreet. Longstreet then wrote to Generals Johnston and Beauregard that Colonel Stuart has been at Munson's Hill since its occupation by our troops. He has been most untiring in the discharge of his duties at that and other advanced positions. Colonel Stuart has, I think, fairly won his claim to brigadier, and I hope the commanding general will unite with me in recommending him for that promotion. Johnston and Beauregard endorsed the promotion, writing, "We think with Brigadier General Longstreet that Colonel Stuart's laborious and valuable services, unintermitted since the war began on this frontier, entitle him to a brigadier generalcy. His calm and daring courage, sagacity, zeal, and activity qualify him admirably for the command of our 3 regiments of cavalry, by which the outpost duty of the army is performed. The government would gain greatly by promoting him." Before Longstreet's endorsement, Johnston wrote to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, that Stuart is a rare man, wonderfully endowed by nature with the qualities necessary for an officer of light cavalry. Calm, firm, acute, active, and enterprising. I know of no one more competent than he to estimate the accuracies before him at their true value. If you add to this army a real brigade of cavalry, you can find no better brigadier general to command it. Stuart's name was becoming widely known throughout the South and the North, but especially the South, thanks in large part to his unofficial publicist and cousin-in-law, John Eston Cook, who wrote articles about him in papers, including the Charleston Courier. In it, Cook described Jeb as the most hated and feared man by Yankees, and compared him to Garibaldi in Italy. He also thought that Stuart's proud, untainted name would be found in the temple of Southern freedom. On September 26th, Stuart got promoted to the rank of brigadier general. Stuart now made his headquarters halfway between Fairfax Courthouse and Centerville. Johnston, his army commander, gave him control of the entire cavalry arm of the army, and Jeb would use it to his best ability. One of his biographers described Stuart's headquarters as a medieval camp. The young general, just 28 years old, loved music, so you could find musicians, both black and white, constantly in and around Stuart's headquarters building, playing music as Stuart asked. Jeb also recruited what one biographer called freaks to his headquarters, unusual individuals like Corporal Hagan, a giant of a man whose beard grew nearly to his eyes and possessed a thunderous voice. A regular to Stuart's headquarters was a young lawyer from Southwest Virginia named John Singleton Mosby. Although just a private, Jeb was drawn to him and requested that Mosby dine with the officers. Soon Mosby would become one of Stuart's most trusted cavalrymen. John Pelham, the well-born Alabamian, took command of Stuart's horse artillery. Pelham resigned from West Point in his first year to join the Confederate Army, and he and Stuart grew ever close during the war. Fitzhugh Lee knew Stuart from their West Point days, becoming friends there and picking up on their friendship when they both joined the Confederate Army. Lee soon became one of Stuart's most trusted subordinates. One day, John Eston Cook, Jeb's unofficial publicist, came to his headquarters and found a Blakely gun in front of the building. That type of weapon was a rifled cannon imported from England, and tethered to that cannon was a huge raccoon that snarled and snapped at anyone who got close to the gun that wasn't his owner. Cook then came to the house where Stuart was and found two ladies there, one young and one older. Both were suspected of being spies. This wasn't the first time that Stuart had to arrest a woman, but he was always kind to his female captives. As he sat at a desk writing out a report, he called for music to be played. 3 black men entered with instruments and began playing tunes. One of them was Bob, technically owned by Stuart, since he was borrowed from his family at Laurel Hill. Just because he amused his suspected spies didn't mean that he didn't fulfill his duty to find spies. He asked if the ladies were amused. They said yes. Then Stuart asked if they would like to see something else of interest. They agreed that they would. Jeb's smile went away, and he pointed to a blood-stained jacket and other garments hanging on the wall. The ladies inquired what that was, and Stuart relayed the story that was the uniform of one of his soldiers who was shot on picket duty near Fairfax Courthouse. He was saving the clothes to send to the young man's mother. Jeb's serious tone hammered home the seriousness with which he took the protection of his soldiers fighting on the front line, and how he felt about spies who tried to give the enemy information about his troops. Later, the ladies were escorted to a carriage that would take them to Army headquarters. Before they left, Stuart bade them farewell and kissed the hand of the younger woman. Cook asked him why he didn't kiss the older woman's hand, and Jeb whispered, because the old lady's hand had a glove upon it. The general then laughed. In this down period for the Army, although Stuart's part in the military operations was always busy, Flora came to visit with her husband, but the nature of war prevented her from staying long. By the end of 1861, Jeb needed to discuss something with Flora. Her father, Philip St. George Cook, decided to stay loyal to the United States. Cook would state that he owed Virginia nothing, but owed the United States much. Jeb told his wife, "For our own and our children's sake, let us determine to act well our parts and bear with the mistakes and errors of others, but by no means attempt justification of what must be condemned. Be consoled by the reflection that your husband and brothers will atone for your father's conduct." In regard to Cook's decision to stay with the United States, Stuart said he will regret it but once, and that will be continually. To take the matter further, Jeb's son was named Philip St. George Cook Stuart. After reflection, he decided that his son's name should be changed. He couldn't stand to have his son named after a traitor. Jeb asked Flora to choose the child's new name, and it became James Ewell Brown Stuart, Jr., and the family would call him Jimmy. Jeb wanted to meet his father-in-law in battle. When a Union officer taken prisoner by Stuart's men told Jeb about his father-in-law whipping the Union horsemen into shape, Jeb responded, "I know he has a command, and I propose to take him prisoner. I married his daughter, and I want to present her with her father, so let him come on." Stuart took his role in the war seriously, and he wouldn't let Flora come between him and his military duties. He warned her that if she came to his headquarters, there was a good chance she wouldn't see him. He closely monitored the scarlet fever, measles, and mumps epidemics in the camp, and wouldn't allow Flora or the children to come if those broke out, as they inevitably did. In some instances, he simply discouraged her from coming, and when she asked for him to come to Richmond, he wrote back, "I don't care what other generals do. All I have to say is that while this war lasts, I will not leave the van of our army unless compelled to. Let that answer put to rest any hope of seeing me in Richmond." Through Stuart's letters, he dreamed about getting a home for the family, where Flora could make it her own, but only when the war was over. Throughout those same letters, Jeb recognized his own mortality, telling Flora to tell her son about his father if he should fall in battle. He truly believed that, bear in mind that if I fall, I'll leave in the sacrifice thus made a legacy more to be prized by my children and you dearest than 10 years of longer life. He wrote to a fellow Confederate that, "I regard it as a foregone conclusion that we shall ultimately whip the Yankees. We are bound to believe that anyhow." But the war is going to be a long and terrible one first. We've only just begun it, and very few of us will see the end." Following in that fatalistic mindset, Stuart took out a $10,000 insurance policy on himself in November 1861, so that in the event of his death, his family would be taken care of. On December 20th, 1861, Stuart led a group of cavalry, artillery, and a brigade of infantry on an expedition to Drainesville to protect foraging parties in the area. Union forces that outnumbered Stuart about 2-1 got to the town first and took up a defensive position. Federal artillery exacted an incredible toll on Stuart's artillery, horses, and infantry, so much so that he pulled his smaller force away from the battle to regroup. Amidst the chaos of the affair at Drainesville, Stuart, probably going off instincts of being a quartermaster, personally took the harnesses off of the dead horses, saving government property from falling into the hands of the enemy. The next day, Stuart returned to Drainesville with reinforcements, but the enemy had left. Confederate forces gathered their wounded and buried their dead. Although the battle ended in a defeat for Stuart, it was a success because he halted the Union advance and protected the Confederate Army foragers operating just a short distance away. Through the winter, Stuart's command grew to 2,200 men, but was expected to protect a front over 50 miles wide. The lack of manpower resulted in some Federal horsemen penetrating the picket lines, but for the most part, Stuart successfully guarded Johnston's army and obtained valuable information about the Union Army now under George B. McClellan. Daniel Harvey Hill, an infantry commander, complained about Stuart's performance to President Jefferson Davis, and Davis wrote to Johnston suggesting that Stuart may not be the person for the job, but Johnston had full faith in Stuart and kept him on as cavalry commander. McClellan began maneuvering his army in what would become the Peninsula Campaign. Johnston, unsure about where the enemy army would move, pulled back to Culpeper Courthouse and waited, evacuating Manassas. Jeb's role as cavalry commander, guarding the withdrawal of Johnston's army, was to burn what supplies couldn't be brought with the army. Stuart's men set fire to piles of bacon taller than houses to destroy it. The smell of frying bacon could be smelt 20 miles away. They destroyed other supplies as well, and in just a few days, Union forces captured Manassas. McClellan began landing his army, numbering over 100,000 men on the peninsula formed by the York and James rivers. Johnston moved his army to the peninsula, but didn't like the idea of fighting on McClellan's terms. A lack of confidence in his defensive line led Johnston to decide to pull back, and Stuart acted as the rear guard again. At one point, the Union army nearly surrounded Stuart, and he extricated himself and his command by riding south to the James River and using the beach as a sandy road to safety. The terrain didn't lend itself to cavalry tactics, so Stuart attached himself to Division Commander James Longstreet and ran his errands when not needed in his cavalry capacity. As Johnston retreated up the peninsula, Jeb continued to guard the army's rear. Now McClellan was approaching Richmond, threatening the capital. Johnston now needed to act. Heavy rains washed away bridges and resulted in 2 of McClellan's corps being isolated. Johnston decided it was time to attack and hopefully destroy one or both of those corps before McClellan could come to their rescue. What resulted was the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. The battle ended in basically a bloody standoff, but a casualty in the battle would change the war in the Eastern Theater. Johnston would be seriously wounded, and Davis replaced him with Stuart's former mentor and superintendent at West Point, Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, before given command of the Confederate Army guarding Richmond, looked like a military failure in many regards. He suffered a defeat in an expedition in the northwestern part of Virginia, where he faced George McClellan, the same man he now faced outside of Richmond. After that defeat, Lee commanded the seacoast in the Carolinas and gave up valuable ground to Federal forces. After that, he came to Richmond as a military advisor to the President, a commander without a command. Now he commanded the largest army in the Confederacy. Stuart thought that his relationship with the army commander would help him assert influence over the upcoming fight. 3 days after Lee took command, Stuart wrote Lee a letter describing the military situation from his perspective and suggested ways to fight McClellan. Lee didn't respond to the letter, so Jeb kept performing his cavalry operations. Stuart's headquarters was at a farmhouse north of Richmond, and as he was prone to do, he set out on horseback to inspect outposts and go beyond those to study the landscape and countryside. Only one man accompanied him, a volunteer aide named Harris von Borka. Borka was a giant of a man for the time, standing 6 foot 2 inches and weighing 250 pounds. He was a Prussian officer turned soldier of fortune. Although his English wasn't the best, he and Stuart got along well, especially because both of them loved to laugh. The two men rode into enemy lines but encountered no Federal pickets or camps and came to a small farmhouse. Jeb knocked on the door in code, and the family let him and von Borcke in. They were to meet a spy at the home, but by dawn, the spy failed to show up. Jeb and von Borcke rode further behind the Union lines to a house just a quarter-mile from a Union camp. The Federal bugler blew reveille as the two men entered the house of the spy. The spy was gravely ill in bed. That was the reason he didn't meet them at the rendezvous point. Stuart sat at his bedside, and the spy told Stuart everything he knew. Jeb and the Prussian traveled back through enemy lines and to Jeb's headquarters. There he instructed John Singleton Mosby to scout to the north and northwest to find the flank of the Union Army. Mosby found that very few troops guarded the Union right flank along the Pamunkey River, and quickly hurried back to inform Stuart. Mosby told Stuart the news and then wrote it all down and signed it. Jeb took the document to Lee's headquarters. Lee wanted Stuart to scout the flank with a sizable force and go into the enemy's rear to disrupt supplies and communications. Stuart then suggested that he may ride completely around the Union Army and approach the Confederate lines from the south. Lee didn't like the idea, being afraid Stuart would get captured or worse, but gave the cavalrymen the latitude to do as he wished. On June 11th, Stuart received his written orders from Lee. It included an appeal to prudence. You must bear constantly in mind, while endeavoring to execute the general purpose of your mission, not to hazard your command or to attempt what your judgment may not approve, but be content to accomplish all the good you can without feeling it necessary to obtain all that might be desired. Stuart assembled 1,200 horsemen and 2 artillery pieces for the job. They took 3 days' rations, and at 2 a.m. on June 12th, Jeb woke up his staff and put his troopers in the saddle. They headed north, and many of the cavalrymen thought they were heading to the Shenandoah Valley to help Stonewall Jackson. When they got to a place called Yellow Tavern, Stuart seemed to confirm that rumor when he headed northwest, but then shifted north to Ashland. After 22 miles, the horsemen rested. On June 13th, Stuart's command headed east toward Hanover Courthouse, where they encountered a squadron of Federal horsemen. The Union troopers turned around and headed south. An attempt to trap them ended in Fitzhugh Lee's men running into a swamp. They encountered some enemy outposts as they traveled south and east. Saber charges dispersed the small bands of Federals. The first resistance that Stuart found was at Lenny's Corner. The Federal horsemen took up a position on a hill along the road. Stuart ordered form 4s, draw sabers, charge. Captain William Latney of the Essex Light Dragoons was about 15 yards ahead of his unit, charging with saber drawn. Captain William Royal, who commanded the Federal cavalry, drew his 2 pistols, and as Latney thundered toward him, Latney's saber slashed Royal, wounding him severely, but the wounded Federal was able to get off 2 pistol shots. Latney was dead before his body hit the road as he tumbled from his horse. The rest of the Confederate cavalry chased off their Union counterparts, and the ride continued. By this point, Stuart found out what he and Lee wanted to know. The Union right flank was unguarded. He could now return the way he came, or do as he suggested to Lee, ride around the Union Army. If he returned the way he came, he most likely would end up encountering Federal horsemen that were chasing after him, making it more known what his intentions were. However, if he kept going and rode around the army, this would conceal his intentions and offer the opportunity of success without having to fight a major engagement, so he decided to press on. At Putney's Ford, Stuart's command encountered Union supply ships. They burned 2 of them and destroyed supply wagons, carrying away prisoners, mules, and horses. Soon after this, one of Stuart's artillery pieces got stuck in some mud, and no matter how the horses or men struggled, they couldn't budge the artillery piece. On the suggestion of a sergeant, the lieutenant of the artillery piece placed a small barrel of whiskey on the gun and promised its contents to his unit if they got the piece unstuck. Nearly instantly, the cannon broke free of the mud. Mosby rode far in advance of Stuart's columns, scouting ahead. Near Tunstall Station, he ran into a cavalry outpost. His horse was too tired to run, so he remained in the saddle, drew his saber, then turned and waved for imaginary troops to come up. The Federal horsemen stopped. Then, as if by magic, Stuart and his horsemen came up at a fast trot. This sight scattered the Federal horsemen. At that station they tried in vain to stop a Union train that passed by, but did set fire to a railroad bridge and an entire wagon train. In the early hours of June 14th, Stuart now had to cross the Chickahominy River. One of his soldiers lived in the area and knew of a ford on his family's place, but when they arrived, the river was too high. Rooney Lee, one of Robert E. Lee's sons, told Stuart the situation. Jeb sat straight in his saddle and stroked his beard. He was shown a partially destroyed bridge about a mile downstream and decided to try to repair it. His men went to work, and Stuart sat on the ground near the bank, eating some of the food confiscated during the raid thus far. He seemed happy as he sat down with Mosby, waiting on his men who had experienced building bridges to finish their work. In 3 hours the bridge was completed, and by 1 p.m. the entire column of rebel horsemen were across the river. Then they set fire to their new construction. As the burnt timbers fell into the river, Federal horsemen approached from the opposite bank. They fired a few shots, but had to watch as their enemy rode away. 7 miles down the road, Stuart halted his column and ate at a local plantation house. He then laid down in the grass under some trees and fell asleep for a couple hours. When he and his column crossed the Chickahominy, they were essentially out of danger. When Jeb awoke, he put Fitzhugh Lee in charge of the expedition and set out with 2 couriers for Richmond, about 28 miles away. The column of horsemen would follow a few hours later. Right before sunrise on June 15th, Stuart entered the Confederate capital. One of Stuart's biographers summarized the expedition well when he wrote, "In 3 days Stuart had ridden 100 miles around the entire Union Army. He had learned what Lee needed to know and raised considerable hell in the process. He had inflicted some damage upon the Federal supply line, and he had fed McClellan's fears that he, not Lee, was in grave danger. Stuart also had shored up Southern morale at a time when the war seemed to be going quite badly." Stuart rode to Lee's headquarters, and the two discussed the exposed Union right flank. With this crucial information, Lee now formulated his battle plan. With the minimal amount of troops, he would hold the Federal army in place and launch devastating attacks against that exposed flank. Jeb then left Lee's headquarters to find Flora, who had just recently arrived in Richmond. The day after returning, Stuart's name grew in the Southern mind. Newspapers ran stories about the expedition, making up fantastical stories about the raiders and what they encountered. All this added to the myth surrounding Jeb Stuart. For days and even weeks, his name was on people's lips all over the South for his exploits. Likewise, the Union Army talked about him too, but they were trying to figure out how he could have done such a feat, riding in amongst and behind their lines and never being brought to battle. Plenty of blame was thrown around the Union High Command for their lack of vigilance. Stuart attended a military drill at Capitol Square. Passers-by, gawkers, and soldiers began to recognize Jeb and eventually called for him to give a speech. He spoke about the heroic character of the Southern Army and the deliverance of the Southern states, then excused himself amid cheers and adulation from the crowd. In Stuart's official report, he included grandiose language and flamboyant prose to explain the raid and its value to the South. In it, he mentioned William Latounyne, the only man lost during the entire expedition. Stuart claimed Latounyne sealed his devotion to his native soil with his blood, and that his men stood unappalled before the Russian torrent of the Chickahominy, with the probability of an enemy at their heels, armed with the fury of a tigress robbed of her whelps. John Eston Cook, Stuart's unofficial publicist, gave a great description of Stuart at this point in the war. He looked far different than he did at the beginning of the conflict, where he wore his old United States Army uniform of blue. Stuart was a gallant figure to look at, the gray coat buttoned to the chin, the light French saber balanced by the pistol in its black holster, the cavalry boots above the knee, and the brown hat with its black plume, floating above the bearded features, the brilliant eyes, and the huge mustache, which curled with laughter at the slightest provocation. These made Stuart the perfect picture of a gay cavalier. Stuart didn't stay idle for long. Lee planned for his assaults known collectively as the 7 Days Battles, and Stuart's role would be to guard Jackson's left flank and clear minor enemy units from Stonewall's front. Jackson acted very odd during these series of battles, either not engaging the enemy or being late in the attempt. Stuart guarded the flank and kept Jackson abreast of the situation, but that's all Stuart could do. At Gaines' Mill, an artillery shell came screaming over the cavalrymen's heads, and John Eston Cook ducked so low as to fall off his horse. Jeb asked if he was hurt, and Cook replied, "Oh no, General, I only dodged too far." Stuart roared with laughter and picked at him for weeks for dodging too far. Also during the battle, he used 2 guns from his horse artillery to drive away Federal artillery that was wreaking havoc on the Confederate infantry in Jackson's front. After that battle, Jeb laid down under a tree to rest from the busy day. Jackson approached his makeshift headquarters and laid down beside him. They discussed the engagement and hypothesized about what McClellan would do, thinking that he would retreat. They were right. McClellan continued to pull back. At White House, a landing area where the Federal Army got their supplies, Union troops burned the White House that gave the location its name and torched as much supplies as it could. but Stuart's cavalry found a good amount undamaged. Jeb missed the Battle of Malvern Hill, but did chase after the retreating Union army. John Pelham, the commander of his horse artillery, which consisted of one cannon at that point, found that the Union army could be seen and peppered with artillery from a place called Evelington Heights. Stuart instructed Pelham to shell the Union troops, which delighted the brigadier general, who sent word to Lee about the opportunity. Jeb hoped that the infantry would come to his support, but both Longstreet and Jackson were too far away, so after Pelham's last shot, the cavalrymen left Evelington Heights. After the 7 days, Robert E. Lee reorganized the Confederate Army of the Potomac, among other things renaming it the Army of Northern Virginia. He also made Jeb a major general within that army on July 25th. His new command increased to a division with 3 brigades, one under Fitzhugh Lee, another under a wealthy South Carolinian named Wade Hampton, who had no prior military experience but raised a great number of troops for the Confederacy, and the 3rd Brigade under Beverly Robertson, which included William Grumble Jones, who disliked Stuart. Jeb called Robertson the most troublesome man I have to deal with. While near Richmond, the flamboyant Cavalier held elaborate reviews of his troops and entertained visitors to his headquarters. Since Flora was nearby, she led the throng of ladies who came to view Stuart's cavalry on parade. As McClellan and his army remained on the peninsula, talking about renewing the offensive, a new Union army menaced central Virginia. John Pope led the Union Army of Virginia and represented another threat to the Confederacy. Lee began to move his troops to meet that threat. Stuart and his staff rode a train to Orange Courthouse, but the cars were too crowded with troops, so they rode in the tender for the locomotive. By the end of the journey, they were covered in soot. At Orange Courthouse, Stuart got his orders from Lee. He would ride into the rear of the Union Army and destroy the railroad bridge near Rappahannock Station. Now Stuart needed to organize his troops for the ride. He, Von Borka, and Mosby met at a home in Verdersville. Fitz Lee's command wasn't up yet, so Stuart tied his horse to a picket fence, spread his cloak on the front porch of a home, took off his sash, hat, and gloves, and laid down to get some sleep. The 2 men who were supposed to keep watch fell asleep. They awoke to the hoofbeats of Federal horsemen. Mosby was the first to hear the hoofbeats and woke Stuart up. Mosby rode off to find Fitz Lee and ran into the Union troopers who fired their pistols. Mosby quickly turned around and rode back toward Stuart. Stuart and Von Borka scrambled for their horses, with Stuart jumping the fence on his horse Skylark. After a mile pursuit, the enemy horsemen gave up. Stuart in his haste left his hat, sash, haversack, and gloves, but he lost something more valuable. One of the watchmen who fell asleep was captured, and he held instructions from Lee about Stuart's ride to the Union rear. This resulted in the Union Army withdrawing. The Federal horsemen were able to get so close to capturing Stuart because they crossed the Rapidan River at a location that was to be guarded by soldiers under Robert Toombs. Toombs had pulled his troops away to cook breakfast, and the way across the Rapidan River was open for the troopers. On August 20th, Stuart and 2 of his brigades, those under Fitz Lee and Robertson, moved across the Rapidan River. As Jeb rode by his troops, every now and then a soldier would yell out, "Where's your hat?" Stuart would just laugh and continue on. He quickly found replacements for his lost accoutrements. On June 21st, Stuart planned to get into the Union rear and destroy the railroad bridge over Cedar Run, where the Orange and Alexandria Railroad ran. On the 22nd, Lee agreed to the plan. In a driving rain and thunderstorm, Stuart's horsemen pushed on toward Catlet Station, first stopping at Warrenton. There he and his staff met a young lady, who, when she found out they were going to Catlet Station, asked Stuart to help her lose a bet. Jeb was perplexed why she would want to lose a bet. She explained that a Union quartermaster named Charles Goulding boarded at her house while the Union Army was in the area, and he bet her a bottle of wine that he would be in Richmond in 30 days. She wanted Jeb to capture Goulding and take him to Richmond as a prisoner, thereby losing her bet but bringing him to Richmond in a way he didn't plan. As Stuart's men rode on, in the darkness they discovered they were in the middle of a Union camp, very near Pope's headquarters. Down the road came a man singing, "Carry me back to old Virginia," using a tin bucket to keep time. He was surprised when he ran into Stuart and his staff. The black man beating on the bucket knew Stuart from a pre-war connection and told them he had been pressed into serving a Union officer. He told Jeb where Pope's headquarters were and the location of the infantry camps. With that information, Jeb got close to Pope's headquarters. Jeb and his troopers got close to Pope's headquarters. Nearby, a group of Union officers huddled in a large tent, drank some toddies, and relaxed. One of them said, "Now, this is something like comfort. I hope Jeb Stuart won't disturb us tonight." About that time, Jeb's bugler sounded charge, and the Southern horsemen burst into the camp. The rebel horsemen carried what they could, burned the rest, and even captured Pope's headquarters, but the general wasn't there. For a consolation prize, they captured Pope's uniform, personal baggage, dispatch book, and money chest containing $500,000 in greenbacks and $20,000 in gold. The troopers detailed to destroy the railroad bridge didn't have any luck because the rain prevented them from burning it, and their attempt to hack away at it with axes became a Herculean task, so Stuart called off the effort. Out of the prisoners that Jeb captured, he asked if any of them was Charles Goulding, the quartermaster who had made the bet with the woman in Warrenton. Goulding stepped forward, and Stuart personally escorted him to the young woman's home and oversaw the ceremony where she presented the bottle of wine to the Union quartermaster. Then he and the officers were sent on to Richmond. Jeb showed Pope's uniform to Jackson, then sent it to Richmond as a gift to Governor John Letcher, who put it on display in the state library in the capital. People thronged to the building to see Stuart's spoils of war. Jeb also sent a letter to Pope himself asking to trade the uniform for his own hat that the Union cavalry captured at Vetersville, but nothing came of the proposition. Stuart's capture of Pope's dispatch book contained copies of his correspondence. Lee found out from these that Pope was waiting on McClellan's forces to reinforce him before he went on the offensive. Stuart's raid, although unsuccessful in burning the bridge, brought Lee something far more valuable. Lee planned for Jackson and Stuart to get in between Pope's army and Washington. Then when Pope was brought to battle, James Longstreet's half of the army would come in and help destroy the Union Army of Virginia. Jackson's foot cavalry got a head start on Stuart, but Stuart caught up to Jackson and rushed ahead to capture Bristow Station on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. When a train passed through, rebel forces attempted to stop it, but were unable to, but Jackson and Stuart were determined to stop the next one. They threw open a switch on the track so that the next train would derail. Then Jackson and Stuart rode to a hill to watch the wreck. Right on time, another locomotive roared down the tracks. When the Confederates fired on the boxcars, the engineers sped the train up, right into the open switch. The train derailed perfectly. Then the red lanterns on the back of the train were smashed so that the next train couldn't see the wreckage, and another locomotive smashed into the one already derailed. After the derailment, Jackson sent Stuart to Manassas Junction to capture Federal supplies there and further disrupt Pope's supply train. After a brief fight, Stuart captured large stores of goods destined for the Union Army. Von Borcke remembered, "It was exceedingly amusing to see here a ragged fellow regaling himself with a box of pickled oysters or potted lobster, there another cutting into a cheese of enormous size, or emptying a bottle of champagne, while hundreds were engaged in opening packages of boots and shoes and other clothing, and fitting themselves with articles of apparel to replace their own tattered garments." Jackson was now at Groveton near Manassas and instructed Stuart to ride between there and Thoroughfare Gap and make sure the way was clear for Longstreet's troops to make the junction with himself. Stuart left out on August 28th. Stuart found resistance along the route, but it was light. Still, he had a skirmish with enemy troops and sent word to Lee, who was traveling with Longstreet, of Jackson's location and the situation. Stuart returned to Jackson, who had begun engaging with Federal forces, and then traveled back along the route to Thoroughfare Gap to meet with Lee and Longstreet personally. He found them and sat on the ground with Lee to conference about their next steps. Stuart would ride along Longstreet's right flank as Longstreet approached the field of battle to relieve Jackson. Stuart rode off to the southeast to guard Longstreet's flank. In the distance, he could see a large Union force moving toward his troops and the flank. He could see at least an entire corps of enemy troops approaching, and this movement threatened Lee's entire plan. Jeb instructed his men to cut down small trees and drag them behind their horses and ride up and down the road, raising a large dust cloud to make the enemy corps think that a large Confederate force was coming toward them. Stuart also instructed his skirmishers to put up stiff resistance to give the illusion of a much larger force. This ruse stopped the corps in its tracks and allowed for Longstreet to deploy his troops. The Union corps eventually turned around. After that near catastrophe, the cavalry didn't have a large role, so Stuart returned to Lee, and when the commanding general rode off on an errand, the cavalryman rolled a rock into place to act as a pillow and took a little nap. When Lee returned and called for Stuart, Jeb instantly jumped up ready for service. Lee wanted some cavalry moved to the other side of the battlefield, and Jeb rode off singing "John the Cavalry" at the top of his lungs. Longstreet was nearby and was amazed at Stuart's ability to sleep and awaken almost mechanically. The next day, August 30th, Stuart's cavalry monitored Longstreet's right flank, and when Longstreet pushed the Federals from the field, Jeb gave chase and encountered Federal cavalry under John Buford. After sending them back across Bull Run, the battle ended. As the Federals continued to withdraw the next day, Stuart's cavalry and artillery dueled with the rear guard of the enemy army. At one point, his troops captured some men of an artillery battery and found that one of the prisoners had at one point been in their command. They brought the deserter to Stuart, who questioned the young man. He had left Stuart's command and joined a Union artillery unit, the same one that fired shots at Stuart and his command. The deserter seemed disinterested in the whole interrogation, even bored at what Stuart was asking. When the deserter reconfirmed all the allegations, Jeb simply said, "Hang him on that tree." The young man's boredom turned to terror as he begged for his life, claiming that he didn't fire a shot, that he was with the wagons. He literally quaked before Stuart, who stood stroking his beard, then rescinded the order and instead ordered, "Take him back to General Lee and report the circumstances." One of Jeb's biographers explained the scene best when he said, "His natural inclination was to reduce complex matters to their simplest terms. He wanted to perceive this war as combat between individuals. At base, his orientation was personal, not corporate or institutional. The young deserter had challenged Stuart with his unconcern. His callous attitude about his actions called into question Stuart's values, so Stuart reacted by ordering the young man hanged immediately. Then, when the deserter had seen graphically the errors of his ways, Stuart could be magnanimous. He and his values had prevailed. The story of the young deserter is about Stuart's attitude toward desertion, to be sure, but is also about the way Stuart perceived himself and responded to the world in which he lived, simply, directly, personally. Hang him on that tree. Robert E. Lee didn't sit idle. After the victory at Second Manassas, the Army of Northern Virginia invaded Maryland, hopefully to draw that state into the southern side and defeat a Union army on its own territory. Stuart's cavalry screened the Army's movements in that state, establishing a 20-mile wide series of outposts to protect Lee's army, but the lack of Union movements made for rather dull duty. Because of that, Stuart, making his headquarters at Urbana, held social events in the town and planned for a large ball to be held on September 8th. The 18th Mississippi's regimental band was asked to play the music, and the regimental battle flags adorned the vacant building, chosen for the celebration of the Confederate Army entering Maryland. The ball was a hit with the town, but artillery fire and musketry broke up the event. Reports came to Stuart that an outpost was under attack. Jeb threw on his saber and rode off for the front. A quick charge by the rebel horsemen and it was over. The wounded men were brought into the building where the ball was being held and ended the party, as the ladies began to tend to the wounded. Federal pressure against Stuart's outpost increased over the next couple of days, and on September 11th the Federal infantry columns were on the move. Stuart worked overtime to prevent the Union Army from knowing the whereabouts of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee stressed that point because at that moment his army was spread out over a wide area. Jackson was at Harper's Ferry and Longstreet's troops were scattered over western Maryland. He would need to concentrate his army to take on the Army of the Potomac and its commander George McClellan. Stuart's role would be to hide Lee's whereabouts and make sure that McClellan didn't realize how spread out Lee was. George McClellan and his Army of the Potomac marched through Maryland on their way to engage Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in September 1862. Jeb Stuart alerted Lee of McClellan's movements and used his cavalry to monitor the Union marching columns. Stuart himself would take some of his cavalry and ride to Harper's Ferry, where Stonewall Jackson was capturing a Union installation. Then Stuart rode back to Lee, informing him of Jackson's situation. The Battle of Antietam erupted on September 17, 1862, but Stuart's role was limited. He and his horsemen were on the extreme left flank of the Confederate Army during the battle, monitoring the flank and keeping it secure. John Pelham's artillery did engage with Union artillery and infantry, but Jeb played a small role in the bloodiest single day in American history. Once the fighting ended, Stuart guarded the Confederate Army's rear as it recrossed the Potomac River and entered northern Virginia. It stayed in the northern section of the Shenandoah Valley for a little while, and Stuart, to protect it, placed his pickets and outposts around the bloodied army, with his headquarters at the Bower, a plantation home near the village of Leestown. The home was owned by Adam Stephen Dandridge II, and Stuart and his staff would stay at the home from late September and on into October. After the duties of the day were done for Stuart and his staff, which counting all the aides and staffers and their slaves numbered close to 100 people, the officers would relax at the Bower, being entertained and entertaining the Dandridge family and the neighbors who came to view the Confederate Cavaliers. They sang and danced the night away on many occasions, and the song "Join the Cavalry" ended the festivities every night. The soldiers became innovative in their ability to entertain their guests. At one point, Harris von Borcke and another man stretched a sheet across the hallway of the home and placed a lamp behind them so that it cast shadows onto the sheet. Then they would act out a thrown-together play. One would play the doctor and the other the patient, and as the patient lay on the table, the doctor would pretend to extract all kinds of things from the patient's throat, like deer antlers, whole cabbages, oyster shells, and boots. In one skit, von Borcke played a fair damsel, and when the two danced, you could tell it was the large Prussian because his boots showed out from under his dress. After the show, Stuart embraced von Borcke and remarked, "My dear old Von, if I ever forget you as I know you on the field of battle, your appearance as a woman would never fade from my memory." News of the fun times had at the Bower spread, and soon Stuart welcomed international journalists stationed in Richmond, who wrote or sketched for the London Times and the London Illustrated News, respectively. All was not happiness at the Bower. Stuart still monitored his outposts, and Union cavalry attempted to penetrate the perimeter surrounding Lee's army. At Martinsburg, Union cavalry under Alfred Pleasonton chased away the Confederate outpost. Stuart arrived outside the town in the presence of Rooney Lee and Wade Hampton and said, "Gentlemen, this thing will not do. I will give you 20 minutes, within which time the town must be again in our possession." Within Stuart's time limit, Hampton and Lee secured the town again for the Confederacy. Stuart had gotten angry at the loss of Martinsburg, if nothing else out of pride. He had known Pleasonton at West Point and didn't care for him then, and didn't want to lose a town to his cavalry. He also wanted to keep up the reputation of his cavalry. As one Union man observed, wherever Stuart rides, he carries terror with him. His victories are half won before he strikes a blow. Our soldiers feel that he may pounce on them at any minute, and that he is as resistless as a hawk in a fowl yard. Losses by his subordinates became personal matters for Stuart, whose reputation was growing as his cavalrymen won victories and terrorized the Union army. Stuart stayed in constant communication with Lee and visited the commanding general's headquarters regularly. On one occasion, he brought Lee a gift, a quiet sorrel mare, raised at the Bower, named Lucy Long. Lee greatly appreciated the gift and would use both her and Traveler as his mounts during the war. Stonewall Jackson's headquarters was closer to Stuart's own headquarters, and Stuart paid him frequent visits. Although their personalities were polar opposite, they got along extremely well, cultivating a great friendship. Some of Jackson's rare humorous statements came as a result of Stuart, or at least in his presence. One night Stuart came to Jackson's headquarters at Bunker Hill late. He found Jackson asleep in his tent. Jeb went into the tent and crawled into bed with Jackson, and the two fought over the covers throughout the night. The next morning, Jeb emerged from the tent to find Jackson standing outside. Jackson said, "General Stuart, I'm always glad to see you here. You might select better hours sometimes, but I'm always glad to have you. But, General, you must not get into my bed with your boots and spurs on and ride me around like a cavalry horse all night." Stuart also bought Jackson a brand new general's uniform, complete with gilded buttons and gold lace. Lee and Stuart during this downtime constructed a plan for a large cavalry expedition into the north. The destination would be Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, with the purpose being to gather as much information about the enemy as possible, to destroy a significant railroad bridge beyond the town, and to take government officials from Pennsylvania hostage to exchange for Southern officials. Plus, Stuart was to find and bring back as many Pennsylvania horses as could be found to replenish Southern cavalry, artillery, and draft animals. On October 10th, Stuart and around 1,800 horsemen crossed the Potomac River at McCoy's Ford, heading for Pennsylvania. Once they got into Pennsylvania, the Confederate cavalrymen spread out to gather up horses, giving receipts saying that their horses had been taken in payment of damages on the part of the United States against the Confederate states. When Stuart got to Chambersburg, he requested the surrender of the town from its officials, or he would start shelling the town. Some city officials came out, and Stuart was quickly in possession of Chambersburg. Again, Stuart was behind the Union Army, which still remained at the Antietam battlefield. Stuart didn't stay at Chambersburg long, just long enough to capture horses and supplies and burn all the supplies they couldn't take with them. The bridge Lee wanted burned couldn't be destroyed, as the rains and the fact that it mostly was constructed of iron prevented Stuart's troopers from setting it ablaze. Stuart didn't return the same way he came. That would risk running into Union cavalry or infantry, since he was operating so close to the Union Army. So he decided to ride around the Union Army again for the second time. By dawn on October 12th, he and his men were near the Potomac River, making a little stopover at Urbana to visit a group of ladies Stuart and his men had become acquainted with during the Maryland campaign. Stuart found Union infantry at the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, blocking their path toward White's Ford. It was a small group of infantry, just one regiment, but if they decided to put up resistance, they could delay Stuart's crossing, and delay could be fatal. Rooney Lee sent a messenger over to the commander of the Union contingent asking for surrender, that he possessed more than enough troops to destroy the Union regiment, and would do so in 15 minutes if they did not. To Lee's astonishment, the enemy abandoned their position, and the Confederate cavalry began crossing the Potomac River. Federal cavalry were closing in on Stuart's position. His rear guard nearly got overtaken by the enemy, but the quick-thinking Stuart threw out dismounted cavalry and his horse artillery to hold the Federal horsemen at bay until the last of his men got across. One of Stuart's biographers summarized the raid. The Chambersburg raid was a remarkable feat. Stuart had ridden around McClellan's army once more. He had traveled 126 miles and covered the final 80 without a stop in less than 36 hours. En route, he had captured about 1,200 horses and destroyed enemy property. He had taken the war to enemy civilians and made fools of their military establishment. To Flora, Stuart wrote that Chambersburg was as great an accomplishment as his first ride around McClellan and the Catlet Station raid. One authority has said of Chambersburg, "I know of no equal exploit in the cavalry annals." Abraham Lincoln said of Stuart, "Stuart's cavalry outmarched ours, having certainly done more marked service on the peninsula and everywhere since." Stuart's exploits grew in the southern and northern mines, and he seemed to be everywhere all at once. Southern civilians, when they found that Stuart was close by, crowded to get a glimpse of the young cavalier. He wasn't yet 30 years old, but he had become a national hero. Poems and songs were written about him, including Ridden a Raid. When Stuart returned to the Bower, a party was held to celebrate the great raid, and Flora came to join in the festivities. While there, Stuart received a gift from a woman living in Baltimore. He opened the gift, and it was a pair of golden spurs, and Flora buckled them on. Stuart afterward would sometimes sign his personal letters, "The Knight of the Golden Spurs." In late October 1862, Stuart was riding near Middleburg, Virginia, and instructed von Borcke to prepare a bivouac nearby. When the Prussian entered the town, the ladies came out and begged to meet Stuart, so von Borcke agreed to get Stuart to come into town and meet with them for 15 minutes. When Stuart entered the town, 50 to 60 ladies gathered waiting to see the general. They began to kiss his hands and the end of his coat. Stuart commented that he would prefer the kisses if they were on his cheek. At that suggestion, the women charged, and as von Borcke stated, the kisses now popped in rapid succession like musketry, and at last became volleys. Stuart had to fight to get away from all the ladies who mobbed him, but he finally extricated himself from their clutches and rode away. The end of October wasn't tough for Stuart just because he was mobbed by women wanting kisses. McClellan was finally marching south and would eventually settle near Warrenton. Lee would use half his army under James Longstreet to follow the Union Army and leave the other half under Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. Stuart and his horsemen had a large task before them. The Cavaliers needed to screen Longstreet's movement, to prevent McClellan from knowing that half of the army's location, and make sure that the infantry didn't get harassed by the Federal cavalry. McClellan's cavalry, supplemented by infantry, constantly hit Stuart's outposts, forcing the outnumbered Confederate horsemen to fight and then fall back. Despite the Union's efforts, they never did break through Stuart's screen and find Longstreet's troops, but it was definitely one of the most laborious and time-consuming jobs of Stuart's Confederate service. He constantly rode from outpost to outpost, personally leading his troops in the fight against the Federals. At one point, von Borcke told Stuart that the general was too far out front, but Stuart was getting irritated about his cavalry becoming too used to retreating and wanted to put up a stubborn stand. Jeb got upset with von Borcke and told him to leave if he wanted to, but he was staying at the front to monitor the engagement. Von Borcke didn't leave, but he did step behind a tree, and almost immediately 3 Federal bullets hit that tree. Stuart, satisfied with his trooper's performance, began to move to the rear when a Federal bullet trimmed off part of his famous mustache. Von Borcke felt vindicated and laughed at his commander and had a fun time telling General Lee about Stuart's loss of hair. It was during this incredible tour of duty that Stuart got word from Flora that their oldest child, little Flora, was gravely ill. His wife wanted him to come to their daughter's bedside, but he couldn't possibly leave his command during one of the most intense moments of his military career. He explained that if his daughter died, then he would be too late, but if she lived, there would be no reason for him to come. He told his staff, "I shall have to leave my child in the hands of God. My duty requires me here." Little Flora died on November 3, 1863. Von Borcke read the letter informing Stuart of her death first, then handed it to the general. Stuart broke down into tears and he had to hold on to the Prussian to keep his balance. He had only found out about her illness on November 2nd, so the suddenness of her death struck him incredibly hard. Stuart asked his wife to come to Culpeper Courthouse, where his headquarters was, so they could grieve together. Flora arrived on November 10th with little Jimmy, not yet 3, in tow. General Lee arrived during Flora's stay to pay his respects to the family for their loss. For weeks after his daughter's death, Stuart could be found crying nearly uncontrollably. A light blue flower on a ride reminded him of little Flora's eyes, and he went into a depression because it brought up vivid memories of the little girl. Amidst the tragedy within his family, Jeb received good news. He was given a 4th Brigade, commanded by newly promoted Brigadier General Rooney Lee. Jeb now commanded over 9,000 men, including his horse artillery. In November, the Union Army got a reorganization. President Abraham Lincoln replaced McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, and the new commander wasted no time moving his command to start an advance toward Richmond. He would move east to Fredericksburg, then cross on pontoon bridges to begin the advance. However, the pontoon bridges would be delayed, giving Lee enough time to maneuver his command to block the Union advance. Stuart screened Lee's movements and moved his headquarters close to Fredericksburg. He christened the headquarters Camp No Camp. His staff lived lavishly, with Stuart's tent boasting 2 fireplaces. Sam Sweeney, his personal banjo player, and his slave Bob accompanied him. Bob had been captured during the Chambersburg raid, losing 2 of Stuart's horses he was in charge of, including one of his favorites, Skylark. By November, Bob was back with Stuart. Although his tent was comfortable, Stuart rarely stayed in it. He was constantly on the move. His cavalry monitored around 50 miles of river outside of Fredericksburg. As the 2 major armies looked at one another across the Rappahannock River while Burnside awaited the pontoon bridges, the men in each army tried to occupy their time. Stuart and von Borcke witnessed a snowball fight between the divisions of Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood. Jeb and the Prussians stood on top of a large wooden box to watch the fun battle. Random snowballs flew toward the 2 men, and they were forced to dodge and even raise a white flag over the headquarters tent. A large party was thrown about 10 miles away from Stuart's headquarters on December 10th, but Stuart refused the invitation. Burnside's army was displaying behavior conducive to a movement, and Jeb wanted to be there in case he was needed by Lee. The next morning, Burnside's artillery began shelling the town of Fredericksburg. From a hill overlooking Fredericksburg, Stuart, Lee, and Longstreet watched the shelling and prepared their men for imminent battle. Union forces marched across the river on pontoon bridges and captured the town of Fredericksburg, and Lee's men sat in defensive positions on Mary's Heights and Prospect Hill. Stuart guarded the Confederate right flank, Lee fearing that a Union contingent could cross further downriver and threaten his flank. John Pelham of Stuart's horse artillery took 1 gun and performed great service, delaying the Union army on the flank for an hour and a half and dueling with around 50 Union artillery pieces. Stuart had to request over and over for Pelham to return to safety before the young man pulled back. Stuart himself was close enough to the action to be hit by a spent bullet in the collar, but it caused no damage. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a miserable defeat for the Union Army and an incredible victory for the Confederacy. The Union withdrew back across the river, and the Confederates went into winter quarters. On Christmas Day, Jackson invited Lee, Stuart, and William Pendleton to his headquarters, which was the office of a wealthy planter, to have a party. Stuart, like always, was the life of the party. Everyone knew Stuart abstained from alcohol, so when he saw the bottle of wine on the dining table, he recoiled in mock horror at the sight. The butter on the table was stamped with a gamecock, and Stuart commented that was Jackson's coat of arms, referring to the decorations on the office walls of the blood sport the animals were placed in. The day after the party, Stuart left for another raid into the rear of the Union Army. He took about 1,800 men and divided them up to march along various routes to confuse the Federals as to his true intentions. South of the village of Dumfries, Stuart encountered some stiff resistance that forced him to withdraw from the fight, but he soon went around the impediment and deeper into enemy-controlled territory. At Occoquan, the Cavaliers found a great amount of Union supplies and even took over the telegraph office at Burke Station. Jeb kept his own telegrapher and was soon receiving messages from Washington and the Union Army talking about how they were going to capture him and his rebel band. Stuart sent his own message to Washington, to the Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, submitting a formal complaint that the mules he captured from the Union Army were of poor quality and unable to carry off all the amount of wagons he had captured from the Union Army. From there he headed west, encountering a large Union force, but in the darkness the Federals weren't able to distinguish who they were. One of Jeb's officers sent word that they would tell them who they were in the morning and built large fires to confuse the Federals, while Stuart and his cavalrymen simply rode around them, avoiding an engagement. Stuart returned to headquarters on January 1, 1863. His Christmas raid had been a success, capturing 200 prisoners, 200 horses, and 80 wagons, with the loss of only 1 killed, 13 wounded, and 13 missing. The raid got little attention from the newspapers because the Battle of Stones River and the Emancipation Proclamation got most of the coverage during that period, but Stuart had embarrassed the Union Army once again. Since Stuart's days on the frontier, he knew that if he was going to be promoted in the military and in the minds of the people, he would need to promote himself. During these winter months, that's exactly what he did. He courted the ears of powerful people, some he knew very well. Custis Lee, his old West Point classmate and friend, was an advisor to President Jefferson Davis, and Stuart asked Lee to come visit him at his headquarters and regularly communicated his exploits to him, knowing that Davis would hear about them. He also navigated the hectic waters of Army politics by being friends with both Stonewall Jackson and A.P. Hill, who were two enemies. Hill wrote to Stuart about Jackson, who Hill called a crazy old Presbyterian fool, and said, "The Almighty will get tired of helping Jackson after a while, and then he'll get the darndest thrashing. And the shoe pinches, for I shall get my share, and probably all the blame, for the people will never blame Stonewall for any disaster." Stuart continued to be close friends with both men, even though their feud was incredibly heated. Stuart became embroiled in a court-martial when Henry Clay Pate, the man his company saved from John Brown in Kansas, accused one of Stuart's favored subordinates, Thomas Rosser, of drunkenness and accused Stuart of favoritism because Rosser had attended West Point. On this later accusation, Pate had formed most of what became the 5th Virginia Cavalry and thought he should have been the one to lead it, yet Rosser was placed as commander of the regiment. Stuart's testimony in the court-martial sustained Rosser as commander of the regiment. Jeb also counseled his brother-in-law, John R. Cook, about dealing with Army politics. He stated, "Be sure, dear John, to keep out of snarls of every kind. They are perfectly abominable." Stuart tried to avoid snarls as well, and even when he got involved, he rarely held grudges. However, that didn't stop others from criticizing him. Lafayette McLaws, one of James Longstreet's division commanders, wrote to fellow division commander and soon-to-be Corps Commander Richard Ewell that Stuart carries around with him a banjo player and a special correspondent. This claptrap is noticed and lauded as a peculiarity of genius, when in fact it is nothing else but the act of a buffoon to attract attention. Jeb was a showman, and he attempted and succeeded at impressing his superiors. But on a cold, rainy day in January 1863, Stuart planned for a review of Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry. Despite the bad weather, Jeb ordered it to continue, most likely because Longstreet and Robert E. Lee were in attendance to watch the review. Jeb wouldn't let the rain detract from the spectacle, but no civilians came out to watch it as he had hoped. Stuart's artillerist, John Pelham, was a fixture at headquarters. Jeb valued Pelham's companionship, almost to obsession, as one of his biographers declared. For example, after begging Stuart for a short leave to visit some of his friends at Orange Courthouse, Stuart finally relented. Pelham dashed off incredibly early for his friend's home. When Stuart sat down for breakfast, Pelham normally joined him. When Jeb asked where Pelham was, an aide told him that he had already left for Orange Courthouse. Instantly, the cavalry commander rescinded Pelham's leave and sent a courier after him to bring him back to headquarters. Anticipating Stuart's actions, Pelham left earlier than usual so he could make it to his friends without being interrupted by Stuart's rescinded leave. In mid-March 1863, Federal cavalry, about 2,000 men strong, broke through one of Stuart's outposts. As usual, when a breakthrough occurred, the nearest units would band together and push the force back. Stuart's perimeter of outposts were second to none, and Stuart regularly rode to the scene of the action to direct movements. This force was a little more stubborn than the usual minor breakthroughs, and Stuart brought up his artillery to help push back the foes. The Federals likewise brought up their artillery, and a duel commenced. Stuart was able to push back the Federals as usual, but he suffered some casualties, and one in particular hurt Stuart. John Pelham was hit in the back of the head by an exploding artillery shell. He would never fully regain consciousness and passed away the next day. At the funeral, Stuart cried over the corpse as he clipped a lock of Pelham's hair, and then he turned around and quietly said, "Farewell." He wrote to Flora soon after that the child she was carrying, whether a boy or a girl, would be named Pelham in some fashion, and he commented that he wanted little Jimmy to grow up to be just like the gallant Pelham. The Union Army facing the Army of Northern Virginia got a new commander in January 1863, Joseph Hooker. Hooker reorganized the army and got it into fighting shape after the disaster at the Battle of Fredericksburg. He planned to march west and cross the Rappahannock to hit Robert E. Lee in the flank near Fredericksburg. Hooker massed his cavalry under George Stoneman, and Stoneman led a foray into the Confederate-held territory. Stuart's force was smaller, particularly because one brigade was still in the Shenandoah Valley, and Wade Hampton's brigade was resting and recruiting after a long stint on outpost duty at the end of 1862, leaving Stuart with roughly 2,000 men to engage the Federals. Robert E. Lee ordered Stuart to split his already small force and send one half to chase after Stoneman and the other to confound the crossing of Hooker's troops. Jeb stayed with the half that took on Hooker's army, delaying its crossing as much as he could. Once across the river, Hooker made it to the little village of Chancellorsville. Longstreet was on an assignment to southeastern Virginia, leaving Stonewall Jackson's half of the army and a few troops from Longstreet's corps to confront the large Union army. Stuart screened Lee's army and also prevented any of Hooker's troops from discovering Lee's dispositions. On the night of May 1, 1863, Jackson and Lee met to discuss how to deal with Hooker's army now that it was on their side of the river. Stuart rode up with valuable information. The Union right flank was unguarded. It was in the air. The morning after Stuart met with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, informing them of the unguarded Union flank, Fitzhugh Lee's horsemen led Jackson's corps to the exposed flank. Stuart rode with Jackson to the stepping-off point, and at 6 p.m., Stonewall's 3 divisions crashed into Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps. Stuart's old friend from West Point attempted to put up resistance, but the charging Confederates pushed all resistance aside. Wanting to cut off the retreating Federal soldiers, Jackson sent some troops to Ely's Ford on the Rappahannock River. Stuart offered to go with a regiment of cavalry to support the infantry, and Jackson agreed to the decision. The rebel cavalier approached the Union camp, but before he could launch an attack, a courier rode up to him, telling him that Jackson had been seriously wounded, and A.P. Hill, the second highest ranking general on the field, was slightly wounded. Stuart needed to take command of Jackson's corps. Jeb gave a few instructions to his troops to dispose of the enemy camp, then rode off into the darkness to find his new command and the fight still going on. It was midnight before Stuart arrived at the point where Jackson's divisions had stopped in their assault. Most of Jackson's staff had left with their leader, and most of Stuart's staff was at Ely's Ford. He didn't know exactly what to do because he didn't know the disposition of his troops or what Jackson had planned. He sent word to Jackson asking for advice, but Jackson simply told him it would be up to his discretion. Then Stuart sent word to Lee, informing him of the situation. Nothing could be done in the darkness, but Stuart knew that he would need to attack at dawn to keep driving the Federals. So he used the remaining darkness to ride up and down his lines, finding brigades and divisions under his command so he could get a better grasp of what would take place the next day. At 3 a.m., a message came to Stuart from Lee. It read, "It is necessary that the glorious victory thus far achieved be prosecuted with the utmost vigor, and the enemy be given no time to rally. They must be pressed so that we can unite the two wings of the army." A half hour later, Lee repeated his first message. "It is all important that you still continue pressing to the right, turning, if possible, all the fortified points in order that we can unite both wings of the army." Stuart also consulted with Edward Porter Alexander about the artillery's role in the coming fight. Alexander told Stuart that a cleared ridge called Hazel Grove would allow his artillery to support the infantry better. Federal soldiers held Hazel Grove, so Stuart made that his first priority. Before daylight hit, Stuart changed into a brand new uniform, made of light blue broadcloth, and replaced his gold cavalry sash with a red artillery sash, underscoring the importance of the artillery in the coming fight. As the sun began to rise over Chancellorsville, Stuart let loose Jackson's corps upon the Federals. The respite during the night allowed many of the Union troops to construct some kind of breastworks to defend themselves, so the battle broke down into bloody volleys between the two sides. Hazel Grove was Stuart's target, and he urged his men on to that rise. Like he did with his cavalry, Stuart was out front of his troops, leading by example. One soldier remembered, "He leaped his horse over the breastworks near my company, and when he had reached a point about opposite the center of the brigade, while the men were loudly cheering him, he waved his hand toward the enemy and shouted, 'Forward, men, forward! Just follow me!' The men were wild with enthusiasm. The veriest coward on earth would have felt his blood thrill and his heart leap with courage and resolution. The men poured over the breastworks after him like a wide raging torrent, overcoming its barriers. After taking Hazel Grove, Stuart placed 30 artillery pieces there, and it would grow to 50 shortly. Confederate forces pushed Hooker's army back toward the Rappahannock River and helped to win Lee a magnificent victory. Jackson would die on May 10th, and even when Jackson was simply recovering from his wounds, Stuart hoped to be given command of Jackson's corps. He would even write a draft of congratulatory order to his corps, but never submitted the report, possibly hoping to submit it when he was given command of that corps. He would keep that order in his pocket the rest of his life. Rumors passed through the army that Stuart would be promoted to lieutenant general and put in command of Jackson's corps. One of Stuart's classmates at West Point, William Dorsey Pender, wrote to his wife that, "Some think in Jackson's absence Stuart will be made lieutenant general, but I hope not." Clearly not everyone agreed with such a promotion. In the end, Lee would take his 2 corps and make 3, retaining Longstreet in command of 1, and giving the other 2 to A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell. One of Stuart's biographers described Stuart's mindset beautifully when he wrote, "Perhaps he had a divided mind on the matter, however. He wanted and believed he had earned larger laurels, but he was also reluctant to leave the cavalry. Since his days at West Point, he had envisioned himself a bold dragoon, and now his vision had materialized. It was almost as though Stuart had made a mold for himself and poured himself into it. He had become the jolly knight he aspired to be, the cavalry-come-warrior figure of his imagining." When Lee reorganized the Army of Northern Virginia, he strengthened Stuart's command, bringing Beverly Robertson's brigade from North Carolina and Grumble Jones's command from the Shenandoah to bolster Stuart's division of cavalry. This was done in great part because the Union Army of the Potomac was concentrating their cavalry, which would make it hard for Stuart to combat his Union counterparts, as seen with Stoneman's raid during the Battle of Chancellorsville. On June 5th, Stuart held a review of his nearly 10,000-man force with civilians, mostly women, coming to Culpeper Courthouse near the site of the Grand Review. The former Secretary of War, George Wythe Randolph, rode a train into town adorned with Stuart's battle flag, and Jeb held a ball the night before the review. In an open field at Brandy Station, JEB Stuart rode out in front of his cavaliers, a picture-perfect example of the cavalier of old. Then, as his staff joined him and perched themselves on a knoll overlooking the field, thousands of horsemen galloped across and down the field with sabers unsheathed, and Stuart's horse artillery let loose numerous volleys. Ladies swooned and men marveled at the grand spectacle. One artilleryman commented that it was a waste of powder, but it was one of the grandest scenes I ever saw. Robert E. Lee was hard at work putting together his plan for his second invasion of the North. The Army of Northern Virginia would leave their quarters on the south side of the Rappahannock and begin their march, and Stuart's cavalry was to screen the movement. Lee wasn't able to come to the Grand Review, but told Stuart he would be happy to review his command on June 8th. Stuart formed his command and held another review for Lee. The soldiers, already tired of the pageantry, didn't like being paraded out for another parade, separated by only a few days. Stuart arrived with himself and his horse bedecked with flowers. Allegedly, Lee made a comment that either John Pope or Ambrose Burnside, depended on the storyteller, greeted his army in the same fashion, and hoped that Stuart would not share in their fate. Lee also asked John Bell Hood, one of James Longstreet's division commanders, to come to the review and bring his people, meaning his staff. Instead, Hood brought his entire division. In this review, there was no galloping or artillery fire. Lee said not to waste horse energy or gunpowder on account of him. The review was held, but it wasn't as grand as the one 3 days earlier. That night, as Stuart and his horsemen rested, Union cavalry were on the move, crossing the Rappahannock in the early morning hours of June 9th. For the Confederates, the attack came out of nowhere, as Alfred Pleasonton's cavalry made a dash on the Confederate encampments. Half-dressed rebel soldiers frantically ran for their horses to mount some kind of defense. Stuart was awakened by the sounds of gunfire. He dashed off a few orders and then rode for the fight. The resourceful Stuart was able to contain John Buford's cavalry division, but Grumble Jones reported that Federals were crossing Kelly's Ford and would be hit in the flanks. Stuart sent word back, "Tell General Jones to attend to the Yankees in his front, and I'll watch the flanks." Beverly Robertson's brigade was supposed to watch Kelly's Ford for such a movement, and Stuart thought that Robertson would notify him of such a movement. In reality, Robertson got to Kelly's Ford, dismounted his force, and simply watched as a column of Union cavalry rode by. This threatened Stuart's entire line. The Union columns were aiming for Fleetwood Hill, a commanding location on the battlefield. Stuart underestimated the size of the enemy force and sent only 2 regiments to engage with the division of enemy troops. When Jeb saw the desperate situation, he ordered every regimental commander to come at a gallop to the hill to push back the Federal column. During the brutal battle, the colonel of the 2nd South Carolina Cavalry, M.C. Butler, sat on his horse talking to one of Stuart's trusted scouts, Will Farley. An artillery shell hit the ground and ricocheted, cutting off a piece of Butler's foot, and entered Butler's horse, then plunged into Farley's horse, exiting the animal and ripping Farley's leg off at the knee. Soldiers went to help the 2 men, and when they got to Farley, he pointed to his severed leg and asked to have it. Then he hugged the gory stump and smiled, saying, "It is an old friend, gentlemen, and I do not wish to part from it." The wound proved fatal, and Farley soon died. Stuart wrote when he heard of Farley's death, "May his spirit abide with us." The battle wound down as Union troops fell back gradually. Jeb lost 523 men, and the Union about 1,000 in the Battle of Brandy Station, mostly a cavalry battle. One of Stuart's aides remembered the battle as a pivotal moment of the Civil War. One result of incalculable importance certainly did follow this battle. It made the Federal cavalry. Up to that time, confessedly inferior to the Southern horsemen, they gained on this day that confidence in themselves and in their commanders which enabled them to contest so fiercely the subsequent battlefields. Thomas Rosser later remembered, "This engagement taught us one thing, however, and that was that the Federal cavalry was improving and fought better on this occasion than ever before." Stuart's reputation took a considerable hit after the engagement at Brandy Station. His own men and the staff of other generals all wrote to their friends and loved ones about Jeb being surprised by the Federal cavalry and nearly losing the battle, if it could be called a victory at all. Stuart had successfully thrown back the Union attack, but being surprised and having to scramble to throw troops into battle made Stuart look like a fool, especially after the spectacle of 2 reviews. A woman from Culpeper felt strongly enough about Stuart's failures that she wrote to President Jefferson Davis saying, "President, allow a true Southern lady to say, General Stuart's conduct since in Culpeper is perfectly ridiculous, having repeated reviews for the benefit of his lady friends, he riding up and down the line thronged with those ladies, he decorated with flowers, apparently a monkey show on hand, and he the monkey. In fact, General Stuart is nothing more or less than one of those fops, devoting his whole time to his lady friends' company." Stuart, in fact, was sent this letter by Custis Lee, his West Point classmate and advisor to Davis, with the instruction to either pay no attention to the ladies or attend to them all, suspecting her of being jealous that Stuart didn't pay her any attention during his time in Culpeper. One of Stuart's biographers fairly summarized the Battle of Brandy Station. Brandy Station was indeed a large cavalry battle, the largest ever in North America. In a strictly tactical sense, it was inconclusive. Neither commander carried the day, although both Stuart and Pleasonton claimed to have done so. Stuart was surprised and embarrassed. Pleasonton certainly failed to accomplish his disperse and destroy mission, and even his claim of a successful reconnaissance in force is nonsense. He already knew Stuart had massed his cavalry near Culpeper. The captured documents of which he boasted were inconsequential items, probably taken from Artillery Chief Beckham's camp desk, which had tumbled from a wagon on the day of the battle. Pleasonton, too, had managed to achieve surprise and then squander his advantage by failing to coordinate the actions of his divided forces. But what about Brandy Station and Stuart? The battle seemed to contradict the image Stuart had of himself. He had been embarrassed, surprised, and nearly defeated. Such things should not afflict heroes. Stuart responded to a sub-Stuart performance not by attempting to improve it, but by insisting that a poor performance had been just perfect. He seemed more concerned with the image than with substance because he confused the two. After Brandy Station, Stuart's cavalry set the screen for the Army of Northern Virginia as it made its way into the Shenandoah Valley and toward Maryland and Pennsylvania. At Aldie, a small fight occurred that interrupted Stuart's and his staff's flirtations with some young ladies at Middleburg. Then a large fight between Stuart's force and Alfred Pleasonton's cavalry erupted near Middleburg. During the fight, sharpshooters hit Harris von Borcke in the neck. The bullet missed the spine but severed his windpipe and went into his lung. Stuart wasn't able to stay with his friend. The battle still raged, and he stayed close by to monitor the situation. The Federal cavalry were trying to find Lee's army, and if they broke through, they would know that the Army of Northern Virginia was spread out and able to defeat it in detail. Stuart prevented that from happening. Then, on the night of June 19th, he went to visit von Borcke on his deathbed. Occasionally, Von would cough up pieces of wool collar that the bullet carried into his lungs, but he lay in a semi-sleep state after being given some opium. Stuart kissed his aide's forehead, and Stuart's tears landed on Von's face. Although the doctors claimed it was a mortal wound, von Borcke recovered, but not to perform duties in the field. Pleasonton requested infantry support from Army Commander Joseph Hooker to deal with Stuart and his cavalry, which Hooker happily gave him. Pleasonton attacked Stuart's outpost again outside of Middleburg, and with infantry support, JEB Stuart's horsemen were forced to fall back, being outgunned. The Battle of Upperville ended with Pleasonton withdrawing and Stuart taking up a position on the same line before the series of battles took place. One of Stuart's staffers recognized something different in Stuart. Ever since Brandy Station, Stuart had not acted himself. In the fights at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, Stuart didn't participate. He even asked Stuart why that was, and Stuart said that he had given all necessary instructions to his brigade commanders, and he wished them to feel the responsibility resting upon them, and to gain whatever honor the field might bring. That made logical sense, but it wasn't like Stuart not to be in the thick of the fight. Stuart also, around this time, wrote to his wife that he believed the Federal soldiers were specifically trying to kill him, given the evidence of von Borcke being hit by sharpshooters while they were riding alongside each other. Maybe Stuart had lost confidence in himself, or because many of his dear friends had died recently, he may have come to recognize his own mortality. By June 22nd, the Pennsylvania campaign was in full swing, with Ewell's corps already in Pennsylvania and Longstreet and Hill's corps in the Shenandoah Valley. Stuart needed to be in multiple places at once. Cavalry needed to hold the gaps in the Blue Ridge to keep Pleasonton from finding Lee's army and preventing its movement. Ewell had a brigade of cavalry with him under Albert Jenkins, but Jenkins wasn't used to large-scale operations. Stuart could follow Lee into Pennsylvania, but if Pleasonton followed Stuart, then Jeb would lead the Federal cavalry right to Lee. So Stuart sent a message off to Longstreet, asking for guidance. Longstreet sent the message to Lee, with both men responding to Stuart. Lee wrote that if Stuart was satisfied with leaving 2 brigades in the gaps along the Blue Ridge, then Stuart could proceed to join Ewell's corps already in Pennsylvania. Longstreet wrote that Stuart should cross the Potomac River in the rear of Hooker's army, which was already on the move, and Longstreet indicated that Lee concurred with that choice of route. John Singleton Mosby rode to Stuart's headquarters and informed him that the cavalry could indeed ride through Hooker's army and cross the Potomac between the Union Army and Washington. Stuart submitted Mosby's report to Lee. On the night of June 23rd, Stuart slept outside under a tree in the rain rather than sleep inside of a house nearby. One of his aides attempted to get him to come inside, but he said, "No, my men are exposed to this rain, and I will not fare any better than they." Something had indeed changed in Stuart. At Fredericksburg, he slept in a tent with 2 fireplaces, and now he chose to sleep out in the weather, just like his men. Later that night, Lee sent his official orders to Stuart: leave 2 brigades in the Blue Ridge, and once the army has made it through the Shenandoah Valley, for them to follow the rest of the army. Stuart would lead the other 3 brigades across the Potomac soon and get to Ewell's right flank. To confuse Hooker and the Union Army, Stuart chose the route through the Union Army to link up with Ewell. On June 25th, Stuart and his column of cavalry left and traveled to Bristow Station, then to Wolf Run Shoals on the Occoquan River. On the 27th, the cavalry passed through Drainesville and to Rouser's Ford on the Potomac River. The river was high, so the cavalry could cross with difficulty, but his artillery was another matter. After examining other fords, Stuart decided to wrestle his artillery across at Rouser's Ford. Everyone had crossed by 3 a.m. on June 28th. By noon, Stuart was in Rockville, Maryland, where he found women in wagons. The women were from an all-female academy, and as the cavaliers passed by, they cut as many buttons from the men's uniforms as they could get their hands on. The wagons amounted to 125, easily captured from a Union supply train. Stuart was just a few miles from Washington when he rounded up the retreating Federals and paroled 400 of them. On June 29th, Jeb pushed north, cutting telegraph lines and ripping apart the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They rested for the night at Union Mills, about 7 miles from a division of Union cavalry. What Stuart didn't know was that he was almost in the middle of the Union Army as it marched north. He also had no contact with Lee. He suspected that part of the army should already be at the Susquehanna River. He was right, Ewell had already gotten to that location. On June 30th, Jeb pressed on to Hanover. There he encountered cavalry under Judson Kilpatrick, which outnumbered his own lead elements. The Confederates charged and the Union countercharged, sending the rebels in different directions and exposing their leader. Jeb and his staff were in danger of being captured and took off into a field where they found themselves nearly surrounded. Jeb led the group through another field as pistol shots flew through the air. They came up on a dead run to a gully formed by a creek 15 feet wide and 4 feet deep. All they could do was jump, and jump they did. Jeb was riding a mare named Virginia, and when he leaped, one of Stuart's aides commented, "I shall never forget the glimpse I then saw of this beautiful animal way up in midair, over the chasm, and Stuart's fine figure sitting erect and firm in the saddle." Stuart sailed over the gully while some of his staff landed in the water. Jeb gave a laugh as they escaped their pursuers. The Federal cavalry held up at the chasm and didn't pursue any further. Part of his command was still fighting, so he lined up the 125 wagons hub to hub to set fire to them in case his men got overrun. The Federal cavalry ceased their attacks, and at dark, Stuart continued north. On July 1st, Stuart hadn't located Lee, so he decided to take off for Carlisle, Pennsylvania, amid the hunger pains of his horses and mules. While en route, Jeb dispatched 2 staffers to look for Lee. At Carlisle, Stuart shelled the town when the militia wouldn't surrender and burned the cavalry barracks on the outside of the town. Late that night, Stuart finally received word of Lee's whereabouts. He was at Gettysburg. Between midnight and 1 a.m., Stuart and his column began marching south to Gettysburg. By the afternoon of July 2nd, Stuart found Lee on Seminary Ridge. Lee greeted him by saying, "Well, General Stuart, you are here at last." The next day, July 3rd, Stuart and his troops headed out for the far left flank of the Confederate Army in the late morning. At about the same time that George Pickett was gaining immortality in the charge that bears his name, Jeb encountered Union cavalry. After sending out dismounted skirmishers, the Federal cavalry showed themselves, and Stuart launched his own charge against the enemy. A Union soldier remembered, "A grander spectacle than their advance has rarely been beheld." They marched with well-aligned fronts and steady reins. Their polished saber blades dazzled in the sun. All eyes turned upon them. Shell and shrapnel met the advancing Confederates and tore through their ranks. Closing the gaps as though nothing had happened, on they came. As they drew nearer, canister was substituted by artillerymen for shell, and horse after horse staggered and fell. Still they came on. George Armstrong Custer led the countercharge. As the 2 columns approached each other, the pace of each increased, when suddenly a crash, like the falling of timber, betokened the crisis. So sudden and violent was the collision that many of the horses were turned end over end and crushed their riders beneath them. The clashing of sabers, the firing of pistols, the demands for surrender and cries of the combatants now filled the air. The battle wound down, and the 2 sides pretty much went back to where they had begun the battle, although both sides would claim victory over the other that day. At dark, Stuart pulled back his main force along the York Turnpike. When Jeb got to Lee's headquarters, he learned of Pickett's failed attack. Lee decided to withdraw, and Stuart would screen the Army's movements back into Virginia. For the next 10 days, Stuart and his cavalry fought and screened the movements of Lee's army. The already exhausted Cavaliers faithfully completed their work, with Stuart guiding and managing their movements. At one point, a horse was shot out from under him, while he directed dismounted cavalry in a skirmish with Federals who were trying to break through his screen. Stuart was the most exhausted that he most likely had ever been. At one point, he hadn't eaten in 24 hours, and his staff took him to a home, and while the family prepared a late supper, Stuart slept on a couch. One of his aides basically dragged him to the dinner table, but he was too tired to eat. The lady of the house asked if the general may prefer a hard-boiled egg. Stuart said, "Yes, I'll take 4 or 5. The words were rude, and the lady soon returned with the eggs. Stuart ate one and then left the table. His staff encouraged the family to play the piano and sing "Join the Cavalry." The song seemed to revive Stuart, who sang along. When he was told how he had behaved to the family, he apologized profusely for his behavior. However, no song could wash him of his exhaustion. Back in Virginia, Stuart established his headquarters near Culpeper, Virginia, calling it Camp Von Borca. While there, reports in newspapers criticized Stuart's absence during the Gettysburg campaign. Even members of Lee's staff blamed Stuart for the defeat at Gettysburg. Lee remarked in his official report that the movements of the army were embarrassed by the absence of cavalry. During that time and after the war, many Southern soldiers blamed Stuart in various degrees for the defeat, including James Longstreet, Moxley Sorrell, Henry Heath, Edward Porter Alexander, Walter Taylor, and Cadmus Wilcox. One of Stuart's aides, Henry McClellan, and his own wife, Flora, were two of his biggest offenders, but they didn't go as far to blame other Southern soldiers. Stuart's most ardent supporter was the Gray Ghost, John Singleton Mosby. Mosby defended Stuart vigorously, attacking Longstreet and Heath for using Stuart to cover up their own mistakes and placing a great amount of blame on Beverly Robertson, whom Stuart left in the gaps of the Blue Ridge to screen Lee's movements and then joined the army on the invasion. Robertson didn't get to Gettysburg until the army was already retreating. Mosby said Stuart had ridden around General Hooker while Robertson had ridden around General Lee. The only thing I blamed Stuart for was not having Robertson shot. In Stuart's official report, he defended himself in the 14,300-word report. In it, he boasted of cutting the Union communications with Washington, destroying railroads, and capturing wagons and prisoners. He claimed that he had left Lee with 3 brigades of cavalry, more than enough to handle duties on the campaign, but they were not properly handled. In one of his most outlandish claims, he blamed Jubal Early for not attempting to find him in Pennsylvania. That certainly wasn't the infantry's job, but that was one way Stuart justified his tardiness. He also blamed A.P. Hill and James Longstreet for not putting themselves in a more favorable position for the route into Pennsylvania. One of Stuart's biographers addressed the problems in mid-1863 when he wrote, "He undertook this raid not to atone for anything, but to confirm his vision of himself, and the difference is more than semantic. Stuart had a serious problem with failure. Perhaps because he had failed so seldom at anything he deemed important, he never learned to confront failure. He feared failure, perhaps more than anything else in life, and certainly more than death. He dealt with failure by not dealing with it, by denying it. Stuart's reports on Brandy Station and Gettysburg, and more so his letters to Flora, reveal him incapable of acknowledging shortcomings, much less failure. Stuart was an ironic victim of his own success. He had so often won that he became incapable of coping with defeat." Following the Gettysburg campaign, Stuart's cavalry division grew to a cavalry corps, with some promotions from regimental commanders to brigade commanders. He held reviews nearly every day, not for a spectacle or in any grand manner, but to get the men used to riding with one another and fighting the enemy together. Company Q, that group of broken-down horses and men that Stuart formed, was abolished when it seemed to be growing at an alarming rate. Full of unhealthy men and horses, as well as some malcontents and malingerers, men discontented with Stuart's command. Stuart would say, "Men who are ill or injured should go to the hospital, stragglers should live only in disgrace, and artful dodgers should be shot." As one of Stuart's biographers wrote, in effect, Stuart dealt with morale problems by ordering them to stop. In September 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac began to move against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. This movement came after George Meade, the Union Army commander, found out that James Longstreet and part of his corps was sent to reinforce Braxton Bragg in the west. The Federal cavalry didn't come alone when they probed Stuart's perimeter of Lee's army. They brought infantry and artillery, scattering Stuart's forces and capturing 3 of JEB's artillery pieces at Culpeper, Virginia. Two Federal cavalry divisions, with infantry and artillery support, now converged on Stuart's command, cornering him along the Rapidan River. The tenacious Stuart placed some well-aimed artillery on a hill and launched his own offensive against the forces coming from the south. This allowed him to extricate his command, but it had been close. Union tactics had changed, and Stuart was feeling it gravely. Meade's offensive was cut short when troops from his own army were sent west to deal with the military situation in Tennessee after the Union defeat at Chickamauga. This allowed Lee to go on the offensive and launch the Bristow Station campaign, where Lee implemented a bold plan, sending his troops north and east to try to get in between Meade and the capital at Washington. The Union Army survived the campaign, and Lee ended Meade's offensive. On this campaign, Stuart's command screened Lee's movements. Jeb encountered Federal cavalry at the old Brandy Station battlefield, but declined to do more than skirmish, being outnumbered. Then, as he watched the Union Army's movements with one brigade near the town of Auburn, he nearly got trapped between an approaching Union corps and the rear guard of another corps. He and his troops hid in a small valley just 150 yards from the Union infantry until all of them had passed. Although it was a tense situation, Stuart gained valuable information about the Union Army's whereabouts and sent word before night fell about where best to attack. The next morning, with the rear guard of the Union Army just 150 yards away, Stuart heard gunfire. It was Richard Ewell's corps engaging with the infantry. Stuart was incredibly happy that Lee was able to send support, and now they could bag the rear guard of Meade's army. Stuart placed his artillery on a hill and let loose a horrendous bombardment into the Union Army camp, scattering the men sitting down to eat breakfast. However, Stuart's artillery barrage made Ewell recoil, thinking that they belonged to the Union Army. The opportunity was lost, and Stuart continued to screen the movement. In the end, Meade got away, and Stuart guarded Lee's army as it moved back across the Rappahannock River. As it guarded the rear of the army, Federal cavalry again came after Stuart's command in force. Stuart had split his command, and the Federal cavalry officer Judson Kilpatrick and his division was chasing after Stuart's half. The other half was commanded by Fitzhugh Lee. Lee and Stuart concocted a plan. Stuart would retreat down the Warrenton Turnpike until the entire enemy division was south of Lee's position. Then Fitzhugh would attack, and they could trap the enemy division between their commands. Stuart retreated a few miles and took up a position behind a ridge. As Kilpatrick drew nearer, Stuart could plainly see the flags and men making up the enemy force, and they were nearing the ridge. Just then, Fitzhugh Lee's guns could be heard behind the force. When the head of Kilpatrick's column turned to face Lee, Stuart sprang the trap. It quickly turned into a chase that lasted 5 miles and got Stuart 250 prisoners and parts of the wagon train, including George Armstrong Custer's spicy letters to a friend, some of which were published in a Richmond paper. The engagement was dubbed the Buckland Races, after the little town that it went through. Kilpatrick avoided putting the incident in his report, and Custer claimed that his men faced a mile-long infantry line. In reality, Stuart outsmarted them, and said that the rout of the enemy at Buckland, the most signal and complete that any cavalry has suffered during the war. There was no daring raids in the fall of 1863. Stuart simply conducted great cavalry operations, blocking Federal attempts to probe Lee's lines, and fending off better equipped and more plentiful enemy troops. On November 5th, Stuart held a formal review, which Robert E. Lee attended. It occurred at Brandy Station, and Virginia's governor, John Letcher, and his wife attended. One soldier, tired of the pageantry, said, General Stuart proposed holding another of his spread eagle grand reviews, which did no good except to give Yankee spies an opportunity to count the exact number of cavalry attached to the Army of Northern Virginia, and to display the foppishness of Stuart, who rode along his war-torn lines with a multitude of bouquets which fair hands had presented to him, fastened in his hat and coat. Also that fall, Flora gave birth to their third child, a girl that Stuart named Virginia Pelham, named after John Pelham, his artillerist, who died earlier that year. James Longstreet, still in the Western Theater, wrote to Stuart and said that the cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joseph Wheeler were like Stuart's command at Bull Run in 1861, not nearly as accomplished or skilled in cavalry tactics as Stuart's command was. Longstreet bemoaned the fact that he didn't have a cavalry officer like Stuart with him in Tennessee and Georgia. Stuart also received bad news at the end of 1863 and into 1864. The horse situation was becoming dire. Feed was hard to come by, with Lee reporting to President Davis that sometimes horses were only able to be given 1 pound of corn per day. Because the government didn't provide horses for the cavalry, Horsemen had to bring their own from home, and if they lost an animal to illness or combat, they had to return home on leave to get another mount. For example, Stuart lost 6 horses to illness or combat in the span of 6 months in 1863. His men were suffering. Stuart also was having a hard time getting weapons. Robert E. Lee explained to Stuart that there are many difficulties in the way of arming the cavalry thoroughly and keeping it in that condition. Few cavalry arms are imported, and those manufactured in the Confederacy are generally rejected. I fear there is great carelessness, too, in the preservation of arms, where infantry arms have been issued to the cavalry. It is stated that they have either been turned in or thrown away in 9 cases out of 10. Federal cavalry were increasingly using repeating carbines, and Stuart's forces were forced to use old infantry rifles to combat them. Around Christmas, Flora came to stay with Stuart at his headquarters. She brought the children, and little Jimmy was now 3.5 years old. He insisted on being called General Jimmy JEB Stuart Jr., and loved to play around the horses. His father encouraged him to be rough and tumble to give him strength. On Christmas Eve, Stuart held a small get-together for his staff and some invited guests, where they enjoyed singing and storytelling. The group opened up a huge box of oysters, which were frozen, so they tossed them on the hot coals and roasted them until they popped open, then ate them. On December 31st, Stuart went to Richmond and spent some time with his older brother, William Alexander Stuart, who was managing the family's affairs in southwest Virginia. Alex's 11-year-old son, Henry, joined the 2 brothers in their discussion. Jeb wanted to buy a house for Flora in Richmond, and Alex was helping Stuart with the purchase. Henry looked up to his Uncle Jeb, and his admiration only grew. Jeb and Alex talked for a little bit, then Jeb interrupted the conversation and turned to Henry and had a serious conversation about refreshments, and asked Henry what would taste good right then. They went to Pizzini's, a legendary confectioner's shop in Richmond. Jeb bought Henry as many sweets as he could eat right there, and bought some to take home with him. Henry would later say that his uncle was the first adult to talk with him as an equal, man to man, and that meant a lot to the young man. The winter was filled with parties, reviews, inspections, and more, and Stuart traveled between the army around Culpeper and Richmond. At a home in Richmond, he and some other generals played charades, and Stuart flirted with 2 women, Hetty and Constance Cary. While playing the game, Stuart held a ladder for Constance, only if Hetty agreed to go backstage with him in a closet. Stuart flirted so much with Hetty that he forgot to hold the ladder, and Fitzhugh Lee had to step in, while Stuart took a seat in the audience. There was some hearsay at one of the parties that Stuart said not to judge his taste by his wife, that she was extremely homely, but it's doubtful he made such a statement based on all the other loving statements he made publicly about his sweet wife. It seemed that Flora heard the rumors of Jeb's flirtations with women and was concerned about her own reputation. Stuart would write to her saying, "As to being laughed at about your husband's fondness for society and ladies, all I can say is that you are better off in that than you would be if I were fonder of some other things that excite no remark in others. The society of ladies will never injure your husband, and ought to receive your encouragement. My correspondence with the ladies is that kind of correspondence which pertains to the position I hold, and which never could obtain with me were I a subordinate officer." He desperately wanted Flora to have a home of her own, and continued throughout the winter to buy a house. He instructed an associate to travel to St. Louis and collect $5,000 that he had left on a deposit in the Bank of the State of Missouri, and convert it to silver or a bank draft on the Baltimore Bank. He intended to use that money to buy his first house. In early February, Jeb was presented with a turkey named Jeb Stuart by the enemy because it dodged all their bullets and escaped their clutches. Stuart decided to eat his namesake and invited Robert E. Lee to feast. Lee said he had to work. Besides, he said, "I could not bear to see Jeb Stuart consumed." Jeb also got a dog during this period that he called Beauty. Late April brought the sun, and that dried up the roads, and everyone knew that the year's campaign season was approaching. In early May, Stuart's scouts reported what he already suspected. The Army of the Potomac was on the move, but there were a couple new generals in that army. Ulysses S. Grant, placed as commander of all Union forces, made his headquarters with that army and commanded Meade. Philip Sheridan came east with Grant and took over the cavalry corps, over 10,000 horsemen. Sheridan petitioned Meade to let him strike Stuart, but Meade wanted him to fulfill the traditional cavalry role. The Union army crossed the river that separated the 2 armies, and Stuart and his cavaliers set off down the Orange Plank Road and found the advancing columns of the blue soldiers. A member of Stuart's staff recalled his commander. Stuart himself, a little in advance of us, with his plumed hat in his hand, looked like an equestrian statue, both man and horse being as motionless as marble, his fine soldierly figure fully revealed in the light of the campfires that were blazing brightly on both sides of the road, as far as the eye could reach, and lighting up the foreground splendidly. Confederate horsemen rode past Stuart in columns of four at full trot, saluting the general with a shout as they galloped toward their designated positions, while the infantry, catching inspiration from their cheers, mingled their loud hurrahs with theirs, in one grand chorus of twice 10,000 voice. It was really a grand spectacle to see these gallant horsemen coming toward us out of the gloom of night into the glare of the fires, making the woods ring with their wild war cries, and the earth tremble beneath their horses' hooves. The Battle of the Wilderness erupted the next morning, with Stuart leading A.P. Hill's corps to the battle site along the Orange Plank Road. The cavalry operated on the fringes of the engagement, and Stuart himself, going through the thick underbrush of the wilderness, got his uniform ripped and his face cut up with briars. The next day, Stuart led Longstreet's artillery under Edward Porter Alexander to a place that would accommodate the artillery in such a labyrinth of trees and underbrush. Stuart took him to a field, but suspected that enemy skirmishers were in the tree line, but wasn't sure, so he told a courier to ride out and see if he could draw their fire. Before traveling very far, bullets began to fly from the tree line, and one clipped the muzzle of the courier's horse. When the courier returned to Stuart, the horse snorted blood on Stuart. Jeb continued to help the infantry, and when the Battle of the Wilderness came to a close, Stuart and his cavalry headed south and east toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, where the next battle erupted. During the opening phase of that engagement, Stuart commanded infantry and cavalry, placing infantry that came on line near the intersection of the Brock Road and the road leading to Spotsylvania Courthouse. On the Union side, Sheridan and Meade were having a heated discussion. Sheridan still wanted to go after Stuart. Meade said, "Never mind, Stuart, he will do about as he pleases anyhow." Sheridan responded, "I can thrash hell out of him any day." Later, Meade told Grant what Sheridan said, and Grant responded, "Did Sheridan say that? Well, he generally knows what he is talking about. Let him start right out and do it." Sheridan set out on May 9th toward Richmond to draw Stuart away from Lee's army so he could destroy the mounted arm of the Confederate army. Union troops arrived at Beaver Dam Station, destroyed railroad cars and track at that location on May 9th, and moved out early on May 10th. Stuart arrived soon after the enemy departed, and although he was concerned over the loss of supplies, he was more worried about the precious cargo of his family who were staying at Beaver Dam Station. His wife Flora, son Jimmy, and daughter Virginia were safe, and Stuart spent a few moments with Flora, but never dismounted. Before he left, he kissed her and said goodbye to her and the children. As they rode away, one of Stuart's staffers, Andrew Reed Venable, remembered him saying that he never expected to survive the war. He had made the statement before on occasion, but never so seriously. Jeb also said that he didn't want to live if the Confederacy were to lose. Stuart rode all day on the 10th, and only stopped at 1 o'clock in the morning on May 11th, when he slept for about 3 hours. Awakened by one of his staff and notified that the enemy was still moving south, Stuart mounted and rode off after Sheridan. By 10 a.m., the Southern cavalry had gotten ahead of the blue columns near an area called Yellow Tavern, and prepared to make a stand there. Stuart was concerned about the defenses of Richmond, and whether they could hold off Sheridan's troops. He sent Henry McClellan, his aide, to Richmond, to ask Jefferson Davis's military advisor, Braxton Bragg, whether he could withstand an attack. In the meantime, Stuart had to make a decision: either block Sheridan from attacking Richmond, or let Sheridan pass and trap him between the defenses of Richmond and himself. Before McClellan could make it back to Stuart, the Cavalier decided on the former, and arrayed his troops along the Telegraph Road, facing west in order to hit Sheridan in the flank as they passed. However, Sheridan was not aiming for Richmond. He was aiming for Stuart. His mission was to eliminate the Southern cavalry. The Union cavalry found the Southern battle line a little before noon on May 11th, and began a ferocious assault on the line under the command of General Lunsford Lomax. As Lomax observed the battle with Stuart, the battle line was now directly commanded by Henry Clay Pate, the man Stuart and his cavalry company rescued in Kansas from John Brown years before. Stuart rode up to Pate and told him to hold his line. Pate said, "I will do it," and then Jeb shook his hand warmly. In the attacks by the Federal cavalry, Pate would lose his life, being shot in the head as his men held on to the last possible moment. By the time McClellan found Stuart at about 2 p.m., the left flank had been pushed back, and now the whole battle line faced south. A lull in the battle commenced until 4 p.m., when Sheridan launched another assault with mounted and dismounted troops. Stuart whistled while his iron-gray horse, named General, cantered behind the thin gray line. A mounted Union charge along the telegraph road broke through Stuart's line. Stuart himself plugged the breakthrough with his reserve, personally leading them forward. Union soldiers were all around him. Jeb leveled his pistol at enemy troopers and fired. As he rode into the enemy to deliver another volley, a dismounted Federal soldier turned and fired his .44 caliber pistol. The bullet entered Stuart's right side just below the ribs. Stuart reeled in his saddle but didn't fall off. As he grasped his side, his hat fell to the ground and his staff gathered around him, attempting to lead his horse to a safe location, but the horse reared and shied away. His staff then dismounted the general and propped him up against a tree until another horse could be provided. Gus Dorsey, the commander of Company K of the 1st Virginia, stayed with the general. Jeb said, "Dorsey, save your men," but Dorsey refused the order and told his commander that he needed to get him to safety first. As soon as a replacement was found, with help, Stuart remounted and rode to the safety of the rear. Fitzhugh Lee came to Stuart while behind the lines, and Stuart told him that the command was his. "Go ahead, Fitz, old fellow. I know you will do what is right." As Stuart lay in the ambulance, he could see some soldiers retreating. He yelled, go back, and do your duty as I have done mine, and our country will be safe. Go back. I had rather die than be whipped." One of his staff officers, Walter Houlihan, who Jeb affectionately called Honeybun, came to see his commander. Jeb asked, "Honeybun, how do I look in the face?" Houlihan said, "General, you are looking right well. You will be all right." Stuart replied, "Well, I don't know how this will turn out, but if it is God's will that I shall die, I am ready." Knowing that whiskey would help Stuart's suffering, Dr. John Fontaine encouraged the general to drink some, but Jeb refused, referring back to his vow to his mother as a little boy to never take a sip of alcohol. His staff encouraged him to drink some to ease the pain, and after repeated requests, Stuart drank a little. He was only a few miles from Richmond, but because of the battle, the ambulance had to take unorthodox roads. After dark, the wounded general arrived at his brother-in-law, Dr. Charles Brewer's home on Grace Street in Richmond. All they could do was apply ice to the wound. His caretakers tried to get a telegraph to Flora at Beaver Dam Station, but because Sheridan's men had cut the telegraph wires, she didn't receive word of the wounding until about noon on May 12th. Her and the Edmund Fontaine family she was staying with were taking care of wounded men from the Spotsylvania battlefield when the message got to her. Edmund Fontaine was the president of the Virginia Central Railroad and would get her a private train to see her husband. However, they could only make it so far because Sheridan had destroyed the tracks near Richmond, so they found an army ambulance and made the trip over the rough roads to Richmond. Through the night of the 11th, Stuart suffered in pain but was alert and lucid until the morning of the 12th. Knowing he was going to die, Stuart began to get his affairs in order. He told McClellan, "I wish you to take one of my horses, and Andrew Reed Venable the other. Which is the heavier rider?" McClellan said that Venable was. Stuart replied, "Then let Venable have the gray horse, and you take the bay." He then told McClellan to look inside his hatband, and he would find a small Confederate flag which a woman in Columbia, South Carolina had sent him earlier in the war, and he wished it returned to her. He directed McClellan to send his spurs to Miss Lily Lee of Shepherdstown, Virginia, and his sword to be given to his son. About that time, Jefferson Davis entered the room and asked, "General, how do you feel?" Stuart replied, "Easy, but willing to die, if God and my country think I have fulfilled my destiny and done my duty." It was getting late in the afternoon, and Stuart began to suffer from agonizing pain. He asked Dr. Brewer if he would survive the night. "No," Brewer said gently. Stuart then said, "I am resigned if it be God's will, but I would like to see my wife. But God's will be done." Around 7 p.m., everyone in the house gathered around his bed. His favorite hymn, Rock of Ages, was sung. He attempted to join in, but was too weak. Once the song was over, Stuart exclaimed, "I am going fast now. I am resigned. God's will be done." He drifted off into unconsciousness, and at 7:38 p.m., his breathing ceased. Flora would arrive at 11:30 that night. As she entered the home, she noticed the quiet of the people and knew that the worst had happened. The next day a funeral was held, with Generals Braxton Bragg, John P. McCown, Robert Chilton, and Alexander Lawton acting as some of the pallbearers. He was laid to rest in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. There was no military display. All the troops were fighting. However, the booming of cannons in the distance acted as a salute to the fallen commander. Stuart wrote out his will in November of 1861. He left everything he owned to Flora and the children, but he owned very little. The will gave a gold pencil to his daughter Flora, who had since died. He left his class ring, diplomas, commissions, and clothes to his wife, his sword to Jimmy. He expressed his wish that his children be raised south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that his family always live in the South. He owned very little, but the most precious and most valuable thing he owned was his name. His name gave a lot of people and his family the ability to financially support themselves. John Eston Cook, Stuart's unofficial publicist, became famous for his novels and stories about Stuart. Harris von Borcke, the large Prussian aide to Stuart, recovered from his wounds he received in June of 1863, even visited Stuart on the general's deathbed. Von would write accounts of Stuart that were published in Prussia as well as the United States. Until his dying day, Von flew a Confederate flag from a tower on his castle in Prussia. Henry McClellan, Stuart's aide, became Stuart's official biographer, creating the most intimate biography of Stuart. Virginia Pelham Stuart, Jeb's youngest child, would get married and live in Norfolk, Virginia, where she would die after giving birth in 1898. James Yule Brown Stuart II, Little Jimmy, would eventually join the United States Army, the same army his father served in and resigned from to fight for the Confederacy. Jimmy would obtain the rank of captain and die in 1930 at the age of 70. Flora would live the rest of her life in the South, even though her father attempted to convince her to come north. She would always be referred to as Mrs. General JEB Stuart. She took a job as the principal of the Virginia Female Institute in Stanton, Virginia. She would die on May 10, 1923, at the age of 87. After her husband's death, she never wore any other color than the black of mourning. Robert E. Lee said of Stuart, "He never brought me a piece of false information, and I can scarcely think of him without weeping." Lee and Stuart had known each other since Jeb's time at West Point, and had only grown closer, with Lee basically acting as a father figure to Stuart. One biographer went as far as calling Lee Stuart's surrogate father. Jeb Stuart was the quintessential cavalryman. The flamboyant Stuart secured Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, bringing it great information about the enemy and screened its movements, making it successful in its various campaigns. Lee's generalship was strengthened by Stuart's horsemanship, because an army commander is only as good as the information provided about the enemy. Did Stuart act extravagant? Yes. But was he great at his job? Absolutely. And no one performed cavalry operations better than Jeb Stuart. Lee's successes were possible to a great deal because of the abilities of Jeb Stuart, and it's more than a coincidence that Lee's greatest defeat at Gettysburg happened when Stuart wasn't with him. Of course, there is plenty of blame to go around, and it's wrong to place it all on Stuart. There were many factors that led to that defeat. Jeb became a legend in his own time, and that legend became difficult for Stuart to live up to at all times, although he tried and succeeded in doing so a great deal. His legend only grew after he died, with his image becoming synonymous with the dashing cavalier, and Stuart embodying that idealized and romantic image. Over 70 years after the end of the Civil War, during the Second World War, the U.S. developed a light tank named the Stuart, named after the cavalryman. Despite his faults, Jeb Stuart will be remembered as he would have wanted, as the loving and seemingly carefree cavalier who feared nothing and made the Union Army and its cavalry look foolish in their attempts to capture him. Despite the attacks leveled at him by his contemporaries and historians, he still rides through history, symbolizing the romantic cavalier.